Hey there, there's nowhere else you need to be right now. I'm Joe, and for the next few hours, the world can keep spinning without either of us. Whatever today asked of you, it's enough. Just let yourself sink into your pillow while I tell you a few strange stories. There are only a few ads in the first 10 minutes, and then the rest of the night is completely uninterrupted. If you enjoy spending your evenings here with me, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's settle in. I was driving back from a friend's wedding in a small town near the Oregon border. It was late September, and I'd stayed way longer than I planned because the reception ran forever, and I didn't want to leave while people were still dancing. By the time I got in my car and pulled out of the parking lot, it was already past 11 at night. I had a choice. I could take the main highway, which was well lit and busy even at that hour, or I could cut through a county road that ran straight over a set of low hills. The county road saved about 40 minutes. I'd driven it once before in daylight, and it seemed harmless enough. Just farmland and fences and the occasional mailbox leaning at the edge of somebody's property. So I picked the shortcut, plugged my phone into the charger, and turned the music up. For the first 20 minutes or so, everything felt completely ordinary. My headlights washed over the yellow lines, the field sat quiet and dark on both sides, and I was singing along to a playlist I'd made for the drive up. I remember feeling relaxed, maybe even a little proud of myself for beating traffic. My tank was more than half full. My phone had plenty of battery, and I figured I'd be home in bed within the hour. The first thing that seemed a little off was the road signs. Out there, they were the small green kind, listing distances to towns I'd never heard of. I passed one that said a place called Halden was 9 miles ahead. A few minutes later, I passed another sign for the same town, and this one also said 9 miles. I told myself I'd misread the first one, or that maybe two signs happened to sit that far apart on purpose. It was a stupid little thing, and I let it go almost immediately. Then I noticed the car ahead of me. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road since I left the wedding, so a pair of red taillights in the distance actually felt kind of comforting at first. Company, you know? Another person out here in the middle of nowhere doing the same thing I was doing. The lights were maybe a quarter mile up, steady and calm, and I settled in behind them without thinking much about it. Here's the part that started to gnaw at me. No matter how I adjusted my speed, the gap between us stayed exactly the same. When I slowed down to check a text at a stop, the lights slowed too. When I pushed up to 65 to close the distance, the lights drifted forward at the same pace and held that quarter mile. It was like they were tied to my bumper by an invisible rope. I want to be clear that at this point I still wasn't scared. I figured the other driver was just cruising at a speed close to mine, and I was overthinking it, the way you do when you're tired and alone with your thoughts. But I kept watching those lights, and the longer I watched, the more I realized something about them wasn't sitting right. I just couldn't figure out what it was yet. I finally figured out what was bothering me about those taillights, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The light never moved. I don't mean they stayed the same distance from me, though they did. I mean they never bounced. Any car driving on a real road goes over bumps and dips and little cracks in the pavement, and the back end shifts up and down even if you barely notice it. These lights sat perfectly still, like two red dots painted onto the darkness. They floated along at a fixed height and never wavered, not even a little, not even when the road clearly rose and fell under my own tires. I told myself the road ahead was probably just smoother than the part I was on. That's the thing about being alone in the dark at midnight. Your brain will hand you any explanation you want. as long as it lets you keep driving without panicking. So I gripped the wheel a little tighter, and I kept my eyes on the yellow lines instead of the lights, and I turned the music up one more notch to fill the quiet. That worked for a couple of miles. Then the radio started to fade. It wasn't a sudden thing. The song I was listening to slowly got quieter, like someone was easing the volume knob down in another room. I reached over and turned it up, and for a second it came back, and then it slid down again on its own. Underneath the music, there was this low, flat hum, almost like the sound a refrigerator makes, except deeper and steadier. I fiddled with the buttons, thinking maybe my phone connection was dropping, but the screen said it was still playing. The bar was moving. The song was going. I just couldn't hear it over that hum anymore. I want to stop here and tell you something about myself, because it matters for the rest of this. I am not a superstitious person. I don't believe in ghosts. I've never done a Ouija board. And when my friends tell scary stories at a campfire, I'm usually the one poking holes in them. So when I say that a cold feeling started creeping up the back of my neck, understand that I fought it. I told myself it was the tiredness. I told myself it was the wedding wine, even though I'd only had 1 glass hours earlier. I told myself I was a grown adult on a paved road with a full tank of gas, and there was nothing out here but cows and corn. Then I passed the Halden sign again. 9 miles. That was 3 times now. And this time I was sure because I'd been driving for at least 15 minutes since the last one, easily long enough to cover 9 miles at the speed I was going. I actually said it out loud in the car. I said, "That's not possible," in the small voice that didn't sound like mine. And the second the words left my mouth, the taillights ahead of me flared brighter, just for a heartbeat, the way brake lights do when someone taps the pedal, except the car wasn't slowing down. The gap between us stayed exactly the same. My hands were sweating on the wheel now. I checked my phone to pull up a map, and this is where it gets bad, because my phone had signal a mile ago and now it had none. Not 1 bar. The little map just showed a blank gray grid with a blue dot floating in the middle of nothing. No roads, no towns, no labels at all. I remember zooming out with my fingers over and over, and no matter how far I zoomed, it stayed gray. Just my blue dot alone in an empty world. I did the thing you're supposed to do. I told myself to be calm and practical. I decided I would find the next real intersection, turn around, and go back to the main highway, even if it added an hour, even if it added 2. I didn't care anymore about saving time. I just wanted to be somewhere with lights and gas stations and other human beings. So I started watching for a place to turn. And that's when I noticed the fences on either side of the road had stopped. For the whole drive, there'd been these wooden fence posts, marking off the farmland, one after another, steady as a heartbeat, in the corner of my eye. Now there was nothing. Just flat black emptiness on both sides, stretching out past where my headlights could reach. No fields, no fences, no mailboxes, no sign that anyone had ever lived out here at all. And the taillights ahead of me were still there, floating, waiting, keeping their perfect quarter mile of distance like they knew exactly where I was going. I decided I was going to turn around whether there was an intersection or not. The road was empty, dead empty, and I figured I could just crank the wheel, do a U-turn right there on the pavement, and point myself back the way I came. It was the first real plan I'd had in miles, and having a plan made me feel a little more like a person and a little less like a scared animal. I slowed the car down. The taillights ahead slowed with me, same as always. I let my speed drop to 20, then 15, then almost to a crawl. My heart was going hard in my chest. I put my hand on the wheel to start the turn, and I looked in my rearview mirror to make sure nothing was coming up behind me. There was another pair of taillights behind me. Now, taillights face away from you. They're on the back of a car, so if I was looking in my mirror and seeing red taillights, that meant there was a car behind me facing the same direction I was, driving away from me. Except it wasn't driving away. It was sitting there in my mirror at the exact same distance the front car kept ahead of me. That same perfect quarter mile, its two red dots floating at the same fixed height, never bouncing, never moving. I was boxed in. One ahead, one behind, both of them showing me the backs of cars that should have been showing me their fronts. I don't think I breathed for a good 5 seconds. I forgot all about the U-turn. My foot came off the brake on its own, and the car started rolling forward again, and both sets of lights adjusted instantly, front and back, holding me in the middle of them like I was a bead on a string being pulled along. That hum I mentioned earlier had gotten louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore because I'd shut the radio off at some point without even realizing I'd done it. The hum was just there, in the air, in the car, in my teeth almost. It had a rhythm to it now, a slow rise and fall, and the worst part was that it sounded a little bit like breathing. Big, slow, patient breathing. The kind you hear from someone asleep in a quiet house. I kept telling myself it was the engine. I knew it wasn't the engine. My engine didn't sound anything like that, and I'd been driving the same car for 4 years. I looked at my speedometer, mostly just to have something normal to look at. It read 55. But here's the thing that finally broke something loose in me. The scenery wasn't moving. My headlights lit up the road ahead, the yellow lines, the black nothing on either side, and none of it was going by. The lines under my car should have been streaming past at 55 miles an hour. Instead, they sat there. I was pressing the gas. The engine was working. The needle said 55, and I was going absolutely nowhere. It was like driving on a treadmill in a black room. That was the moment I understood, really understood deep down, that whatever was happening to me was not something I could explain away with tiredness or wine or a bad map app. Something had taken me off the normal road and put me somewhere else, somewhere that only looked like a road, and it was moving me through it at its own pace, not mine. I did the only thing left that I could think of. I stopped the car completely. I stood on the brake with both feet, and I threw it into park, and I just stopped. The engine idled. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep them on the wheel. The taillights in front of me stopped too. So did the ones behind me. Everything went still. The hum kept rising and falling, that slow breathing sound, patient as ever, filling up the whole car. And then very slowly, the pair of taillights ahead of me began to turn around. Not the car, just the lights. The two red dots rotated in place, swinging toward each other and then apart, and as they turned, they changed from red to a pale, sick white. And I realized I wasn't looking at taillights at all. I had never been looking at taillights. I'd been following two round white shapes down that road for the better part of an hour, and now they were facing me, and they were low to the ground, and they were much too far apart to belong to any human face, and they were looking right back at me through my windshield. I'm going to try to describe what I saw, but I want you to know ahead of time that I've never been able to describe it right. Every time I try, the words come out too small for it. The two pale shapes hung there in the darkness, where the taillights had been, and they weren't eyes, not exactly. But my brain kept insisting they were eyes because that was the closest thing it had to file them under. They didn't have a face around them. There was no head, no body, nothing connecting them or holding them up. Just two dim white circles floating a couple of feet off the ground, spaced wider apart than any face could be, staring in at me through the glass. The breathing sound was so loud now that I could feel it in the seat. Rise and fall. Rise and fall. And with each rise, the two white shapes drifted a little closer to my windshield. Not fast. Nothing about this thing was ever fast. It was slow and certain, like it had all the time in the world, and it knew I had nowhere to go, because I didn't. My doors were locked. My phone was a gray screen with a lonely blue dot. The road behind me had its own pair of lights blocking the way, and the road ahead had this. I want to tell you I did something brave. I didn't. I sat frozen in my seat with my foot mashed on a brake I didn't even need anymore, staring at the thing while it came for me, and the only thought going through my head was a memory of my grandmother. Specifically, I was thinking about something she used to say when I was a kid, and I'd get scared at night. She'd tell me that whatever was in the dark could only come as close as I let it, and that if I looked away from it and thought about something I loved instead, it would lose its grip. As a kid, I thought that was just a nice thing grown-ups said to help you fall asleep. Sitting in that car, out of options, I decided it was the only weapon I had left. So I closed my eyes. It was the hardest thing I've ever made myself do, shutting my eyes with that thing floating inches from my face. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep watching it, to see it coming. But I closed my eyes anyway, and I pictured my grandmother's kitchen. I pictured the yellow curtains over her sink and the smell of the bread she used to bake, and the sound of her humming while she cooked. A real hum, a warm one, nothing like the awful breathing pressing in on me from outside. I held onto that kitchen with everything I had, and I said her name out loud, over and over, and I did not open my eyes. The breathing changed. The steady rise and fall stumbled, like something that had been perfectly patient for a very long time had just run into a wall it wasn't expecting. The hum broke apart into a sound I can only describe as frustration. This low grinding noise that climbed higher and higher until it wasn't a hum anymore at all. And through my closed eyelids, I could tell the light was changing. That pale, sick glow that had been filling the car dimmed down, flickered, and started to fade. I kept my eyes shut. I kept saying her name. I pictured the bread and the curtains and the humming, and I refused, absolutely refused to look. I don't know how long I sat like that. It felt like an hour. It was probably 90 seconds. But at some point, I noticed that the seat had stopped shaking, and the air didn't feel thick anymore, and the only sound in the car was my own ragged breathing, and the ordinary rumble of my engine idling. The awful breathing was gone. The pressure was gone. That heavy, watched feeling that had been sitting on me for the last hour had simply lifted, like a weight taken off my chest. I still didn't want to open my eyes, but I made myself do it one at a time, half expecting the white shapes to be right there against the glass waiting for me to look. They weren't. My windshield showed me an ordinary dark road. Yellow lines, black fields on either side, and off in the distance ahead of me, real lights this time, the orange glow of a gas station sign and the white glare of an overpass, bouncing gently the way real lights are supposed to bounce. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. 3 bars. A string of texts I'd missed came flooding in all at once. I put the car in drive, and I went toward those lights, and I did not look in my rearview mirror the entire way. I pulled into that gas station, going way too fast, and I parked crooked across 2 spots, and I just sat there for a while with my hands in my lap, shaking. The clock on my dash said it was almost 2 a.m. That stopped me cold. I'd left the wedding a little after 11. The county road was supposed to take about 45 minutes end to end. I should have been home and asleep by midnight. Instead, nearly 3 hours had gone by, and I had no idea where most of them went. When I finally got out of the car, my legs barely held me up. I went inside and bought a coffee. I didn't want just to have a reason to stand under bright lights near another human being. The guy behind the counter was maybe 60, heavyset, watching a little TV with the sound off. He took one look at my face and asked if I was all right. I must have looked terrible, because he asked it like he already knew the answer was no. I didn't tell him the real story. I couldn't. I just said I'd taken the county road and gotten kind of turned around out there. And the man went quiet for a second. And then he set down his coffee and he looked at me in a way I still think about. He asked me which county road. And when I described it, the crossroads where I'd turned off the highway, the low hills, the sign for a town called Halden, he got this expression on his face that I can only call tired. Like this was a conversation he'd had before and hated having. He told me there is no town called Halden. He lived in that area his whole life, and there had never been a town by that name, not for as far back as anyone could remember. He said the county puts up the signs anyway. He didn't explain why. He just said that every so often, somebody comes stumbling in off that road in the middle of the night, looking exactly like I looked, and that the ones who make it in are the ones who figured out on their own that you're not supposed to follow the lights. He said it plain, like he was telling me the store closed at midnight. Then he asked if I wanted my coffee in a to-go cup, and that was the end of it. I have gone back and forth about that conversation for years. Part of me thinks the old man was just messing with a scared kid, spinning a local ghost story because I looked like an easy target. That's the explanation I reach for when I want to sleep at night. But then I remember the taillights that never bounced, and the sign that said 9 miles 3 times, and the scenery that stopped moving while my speedometer read 55, and the 2 pale shapes turning to face me through the glass. And I remember that my phone, when I finally looked at the map again in the safety of that parking lot, showed the county road ending at the highway with nothing in between. No hills, no fields I'd driven past for an hour, no town called Halden, of course, but also no town of any kind. Just a short straight line that should have taken 45 minutes and somehow took 3 hours off my life. I made it home that night. I want to be clear about that because I know how this kind of story usually goes, and I don't want you sitting there thinking something terrible got me in the end. It didn't. I drove the rest of the way on the main highway with every light in the car turned on, and I got into my own bed as the sun was coming up. And I slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke up, I thought maybe I'd dream it all, the way you convince yourself of things in daylight. But the coffee cup from that gas station was still in my cup holder. It was real. It happened. Here's the thing I've never been able to let go of, the detail that keeps me on the interstate to this day, even when it costs me an extra hour. And when I closed my eyes in that car and thought about my grandmother's kitchen, and that thing outside got frustrated and faded away, I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd been let go, like it could have kept coming and it chose not to, the way you might put down a book you've lost interest in. Whatever was out there on that road wasn't beaten by a scared 24-year-old thinking about bread. It just decided I wasn't worth the trouble that particular night. And the part that keeps me up sometimes, all these years later, is a simple question I can't answer. If it let me go so easily, then it's still out there. It's still patient. It still has all the time in the world. And every so often, on some empty county road at midnight, someone else is settling in behind a pair of steady red taillights, feeling grateful for the company, thinking they found somebody to follow home. I hope they closed their eyes in time. That's the whole story, and it's all true. At least as true as I can make it after all this time carrying it around. If you take one thing away from it, let it be this. When you're out there alone in the dark and something up ahead seems like it's leading the way, be very sure it's actually a car before you decide to follow. Story 2. People always ask me why I sold my car. It was a good car, only 3 years old, barely any miles on it. I tell them I wanted something bigger, or that the payments were too high, and they believe me because those are normal reasons. The real reason is that I couldn't sit in it anymore, without remembering what happened during those 2 days I spent driving through the desert. My name is Cody, and I was 29 when it happened. I'd taken a job in a new city, about 1,100 miles from where I grew up. Nothing dramatic, just a better position at a bigger company. And I figured instead of flying and shipping my stuff, I'd load up the car and make a road trip out of it. I'd always wanted to do one of those long solo drives where you see the country change outside your window. So I mapped out a route that cut across a big stretch of open desert in the southwest, booked a cheap motel for the halfway point, and set off early on a Tuesday morning feeling pretty good about my life. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. Long, empty highways, mountains far off in the distance, gas stations where the coffee was bad but the people were friendly. I listened to podcasts and rolled the windows down and stopped whenever I saw something worth looking at. By late afternoon, I was deep into the desert part of the drive, and it was honestly beautiful out there. Miles and miles of flat orange ground with those tall cactus plants standing around like people, and a sky so wide it almost made me dizzy. The trouble started small, the way it always does. I was making good time, so around dinner I decided I'd push a little farther than planned before stopping for the night. My motel was still a few hours out, but there was supposed to be a small town called Bishop Fork, about halfway there, where I could grab food and stretch my legs. I'd seen it on the map, a little dot in all that empty space, and I'd been looking forward to a real meal. The sun was going down as I got close to where the town should have been. I watched the mile markers, counting down, my stomach growling. According to my map, I should have been rolling into Bishop Fork any minute. But the desert just kept going. No town, no buildings, no lights. I passed the spot where the dot was supposed to be, and there was nothing there but more flat orange ground turning gray in the dusk. I figured the map was just off by a few miles, the way they sometimes are out in the middle of nowhere. So I kept driving and kept watching. That's when I saw the man walking on the side of the road. He was maybe a half mile ahead off to the right, moving in the same direction I was driving. Out in all that emptiness, a person on foot was such a strange thing to see that I actually leaned forward to get a better look. He was tall and thin, wearing regular clothes, jeans, and a plain shirt, walking at a steady pace along the shoulder with his back to me. No car anywhere, no broken down vehicle on the roadside. Just a man walking through the desert at dusk, miles and miles from anything. My first thought was that he needed help. Nobody walks out there for fun. I slowed down as I got closer, already rolling my window down to ask if he was okay, if he needed a ride to the next town. And as I came up alongside him, he turned his head and looked at me, and I got my first good look at his face. His face was completely ordinary. That's the part I need you to understand because it's what threw me off. I'd braced myself for something wrong. Some reason my gut had tightened up as I slowed down, but he was just a regular guy. Middle-aged, a little sunburned, tired-looking eyes. He gave me a small, polite smile as I pulled up next to him. The kind of smile a stranger gives you when they're grateful you stopped. And I felt silly for being nervous. Here was a person clearly in a bad spot, and I'd almost driven past him. I asked if he was all right, if his car had broken down somewhere. He said his truck had died a few miles back and his phone had no signal out here, which I completely believed because mine didn't either. He said he was trying to make it to Bishop Fork on foot, and he asked very politely if I could give him a lift the rest of the way. It was exactly the kind of thing you'd expect a stranded person to say. Everything about it made sense. And still, sitting there with my foot on the brake, my window down, I hesitated. I can't fully explain the hesitation. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was calm and friendly, and his story held together. But there was this quiet voice in the back of my head, real faint, telling me not to unlock the door. I've thought about that voice a lot since then. I think some part of us notices things before the rest of us catches up. Little details that don't add up, and it tries to warn us in the only way it can. At the time, I just felt like a jerk for being suspicious of a guy who needed help. So I pushed the feeling down, and I reached over and unlocked the passenger door. He got in, thanked me a few times, and we started driving. For the first few minutes, it was normal. He told me his name was Walter, and that he did some kind of contracting work in towns around the region. He asked where I was headed, and I told him about the new job and the move. He nodded along and said all the right things, wished me luck, said the desert drive was a beautiful way to start a new chapter. Regular small talk between two strangers in a car. I started to relax again and even felt good about myself for stopping. Then I noticed he didn't have any dust on him. I know how strange that sounds, but stick with me. This man said he'd walked several miles along a desert shoulder after his truck died. The shoulder out there is a loose orange dirt and fine sand. The kind of stuff that coats your shoes and your pant legs the second you step on it. I'd stopped earlier that day to take pictures, and my own sneakers had turned orange just from standing around for 2 minutes. Walter's shoes were clean, his jeans were clean, his hands, resting on his knees, were clean. He looked like a man who'd stepped out of a shower. Not a man who'd hiked through the desert at the end of a hot day. I told myself there were 100 explanations. Maybe he'd only walked a short distance. Maybe he'd been sitting in the shade of a rock and I'd caught him right when he started. Maybe the dust just didn't stick to whatever fabric his jeans were made of. My brain lined up these little reasons one after another, and each one sounded thin even as I thought it. But I kept driving, because what else was I going to do? Throw a stranger out of my car in the middle of nowhere because his pants were too clean? The sun was almost gone now. The sky had gone that deep purple color it gets right before full dark, and my headlights clicked on automatically. Walter had gotten quieter. The friendly small talk had trailed off, and now he was just looking out the windshield. Very still, his hands flat on his knees. I glanced at the fuel gauge, and I had plenty of gas. I glanced at the odometer to see how far we'd gone since I picked him up, and I did some quick math in my head, and my stomach dropped a little. We'd been driving for over 20 minutes. At the speed I was going, we should have hit Bishop Fork 10 minutes ago, easily. But the desert outside was as empty as ever. No town, no lights on the horizon. Nothing but flat, dark ground rolling by on both sides. I cleared my throat and asked Walter, as casually as I could, how much farther the town was. And without turning his head, still staring straight ahead through the windshield, he said something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He said very softly, "It's not much farther now." That was all. Not a distance, not a number of miles, Just those words, said in a flat, patient voice, like he was talking about something other than a town. I kept my eyes on the road and tried to act normal, but my mind was racing now. Something about the way he'd said it, "It's not much farther now," sat wrong in my chest. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone. There was a kind of anticipation in it. The way a person sounds when they're waiting for something they've been looking forward to for a long time. I told myself I was reading too much into a stranger's tired voice. But that quiet warning in the back of my head had gotten louder, and this time I didn't push it down. I decided I would find any excuse to stop the car and get him out. My plan was to say I needed to check my tire, or that I was feeling sick. Anything to pull over and put some distance between us. But before I could open my mouth, Walter spoke again. He asked me in that same soft voice if I was traveling alone, if anybody knew what road I was on, if anyone was expecting me that night. Now, those are the exact questions you are never supposed to answer honestly. To a stranger, anybody who's driven alone knows that. And the fact that he was asking them all three in a row, calm and casual, told me everything I needed to know. This was not a man making conversation. This was a man collecting information. I lied. I told him my brother was following about 20 minutes behind me in another car, that we were doing the drive together and had just gotten separated at the last gas stop. I said it fast and easy, like it was true, and I even added that my brother got worried when I didn't check in, so he'd probably be catching up soon. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his head and looked at me. And for the first time since he'd gotten in the car, that polite smile was gone. His face was flat and still, and his eyes had this dull, patient quality, like he was looking at something he'd already decided about. He said, "No, he's not." Just that. No, he's not. And then he faced the front again and folded his hands back on his knees. My whole body went cold. He knew I was lying. Somehow he knew there was no brother, no second car, nobody coming. And the calm, certain way he said it told me he wasn't guessing. I've never in my life felt so alone as I did in that second. In a car in the dark desert, with a man who knew that nobody in the world had any idea where I was. I did the only thing my panicking brain could come up with. I started slowing the car down, telling him I thought I heard something wrong with the engine, that I needed to pull over and check it. My voice was shaking, and I'm sure he heard it. As I eased off the gas, Walter said, still facing forward, "You should keep driving." Not a request, not advice. An instruction delivered in that same flat voice, and there was something underneath it now, something cold and hard that hadn't been there during all the friendly small talk. I want to tell you I was brave. I wasn't. My hands were locked on the wheel and my foot was frozen halfway between the gas and the brake, and for a couple of seconds, I genuinely didn't know what to do. Every choice felt like the wrong one. If I stopped, I'd be sitting still in the dark with him. If I kept driving, I'd be taking us both deeper into wherever this road went, which clearly wasn't Bishop Fork and clearly wasn't anywhere good. And then I noticed the smell. It had crept in so slowly I hadn't registered it, but now that I was paying attention, it was unmistakable. It was the smell of dry earth and something rotten underneath, faint and sweet and sickly, the kind of smell that gets into the back of your throat. It was coming from him, from Walter. This clean, dustless man sitting a couple of feet away from me smelled like the inside of an old grave, like turned soil and something that had been in the ground a long, long time. And as I finally let myself really look at him, Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that his skin, in the glow of the dashboard lights, had a grayish color to it that no living, sunburned man should have. That was the moment the last piece of me that had been making excuses just went silent. Whatever was sitting in my passenger seat, it wasn't a man who'd broken down on the side of the road. It never had been. It had been waiting out there in the dark for someone kind enough or foolish enough to slow down, and I had done exactly that. Here's the thing about pure fear. It doesn't make you scream and cry the way it does in movies. At least it didn't for me. It made me very quiet and very focused, like all the noise in my head suddenly switched off and left just one clear thought behind. And that one thought was, I need to get him out of this car, and I need to do it now. I couldn't fight him. I didn't know what he was, and picking a fight with something that smelled like a grave and knew I was lying was a good way to end up as another person who vanished on a desert highway. I couldn't outrun him on foot either, not out there with nowhere to go. So my plan, if you can even call it a plan, came down to the only thing I had control over, which was the car itself. I thought about the seatbelt. He'd never put his on. When he climbed in, he'd just settled into the seat and folded his hands. And the belt had stayed hanging by the door the whole time. I don't know why my brain grabbed onto that detail, but it did. I kept driving, steady, like I'd given up and decided to obey him. I wanted him to think I was following his instruction to keep going. And while I drove, I watched the road ahead as far as my headlights would reach, waiting for something I could use. Walter had gone still and silent again beside me, staring forward. And that patient waiting feeling was thick in the air, like he knew we were getting close to wherever he wanted us to end up. After a couple of minutes, I saw it. Up ahead, the road bent to the left, a long, slow curve, and on the outside of that curve, the shoulder dropped away into a shallow ditch full of scrubby desert brush. It wasn't much, but it was something. I made myself breathe. I kept the car steady, and I let it drift toward the curve, and I gripped the wheel, and I waited until the very last second. Then I did two things at once. I stood on the brake as hard as I could, and I yanked the wheel hard to the right, sending the car lurching off the road and down into that ditch. The whole world turned into noise and shaking. My seatbelt locked across my chest and slammed the air out of me. And Walter, with nothing holding him in, went forward and sideways all at once. I heard him hit the dashboard and the door, this heavy, wrong-sounding thud. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw him crumpled halfway into the footwell, twisted in a way that a real body doesn't twist. The car bounced hard and came to a stop at an angle in the ditch, nose down, engine still running. I didn't wait. I didn't look at him. I threw the car into reverse and I pressed the gas, and the tires spun in the loose sand, screaming, throwing dirt everywhere. And for one horrible second, the car didn't move, and I thought I was stuck out there with him. Then the tires caught. The car heaved itself backward up out of the ditch and onto the pavement, and I cranked the wheel and got it pointed straight down the road, and I drove. I drove faster than I have ever driven in my life. I had both hands on the wheel, and I was leaning forward, and I did not look at the passenger seat, because I was terrified that if I looked, he'd be sitting up again, folding his hands, giving me that polite smile. I could still smell him in the car, that dry, rotten grave smell, and I rolled every window down to get it out, and the desert air came roaring in cold, and I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead. I don't know exactly when he was gone. At some point, maybe a mile down the road, maybe two, I realized the smell had faded. The cold, heavy, waiting feeling that had been sitting in the car with me had lifted. I made myself glance at the passenger seat. Just a quick look, ready to jerk my eyes back to the road. The seat was empty. The seatbelt hung by the door exactly where it had been when he first climbed in. There was no sign anyone had ever been there at all. No dust, because of course there had never been any dust. Just an empty seat, an open window, and the wind. I don't know if he fell out somehow when I hit the ditch. I don't know if he was ever really there in a way that leaving the car even meant anything. All I know is that he was gone, and I was still going. And up ahead, far off on the dark horizon, I finally saw lights. Real lights, a cluster of them, low and yellow and steady, the honest glow of a real town where real people were. I made it to those lights. The town wasn't Bishop Fork. It was a different place entirely, called Alder Springs, sitting about 40 miles farther down the highway than Bishop Fork ever should have been. That's a detail I still can't work out. I'd been driving toward Bishop Fork for what felt like ages, and I never reached it. And then somehow I came out the other side near a town that was supposed to be much, much farther away. It's like that whole stretch of road between the two places folded up on itself while Walter was in the car, and only let go of me once he was gone. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, parked under the brightest light I could find, and I sat there for a long time, just shaking and breathing. When I finally felt steady enough to move, I got out and I walked all the way around my car, checking it. There were long scrapes down the passenger side from the brush in the ditch, and the front bumper was cracked, and there was orange desert dirt packed into the wheel wells. So that part was real. I hadn't imagined driving into the ditch. The damage was right there where anyone could see it. But here's what got me. Standing there in that gas station light at almost midnight. On the inside of the passenger window, the one Walter had been sitting next to, there was a handprint. It was pressed into the glass from the inside, a full, clear print of a hand, fingers spread wide. And it was too big. I put my own hand up next to it to compare, and the print on the glass was noticeably larger than mine, the fingers longer, the whole shape of it just slightly wrong, the way his body had looked slightly wrong when it twisted into the footwell. I stared at that print for a long time. Then I went inside, bought some paper towels and a bottle of window cleaner, came back out, and scrubbed it off the glass with my hands trembling the whole time. I couldn't stand the idea of driving the rest of the way with it there. I went inside to pay and to buy something to eat because I hadn't eaten since lunch and my body was starting to shut down from all of it. The woman behind the counter was older, quiet, the kind of person who's worked a night shift alone for years and doesn't rattle easily. She looked at me and asked if I'd come in off the desert highway. I said I had. She asked, real casual, if I'd stopped for anybody along the way. And the way she asked it, not surprised, not curious, just tired and knowing, made my blood run cold all over again. I told her the truth. I told her about the man walking on the shoulder, about picking him up, about how the town I was aiming for never appeared, about the questions he asked and the smell and how I drove him into a ditch to get him out of my car. I expected her to laugh at me or call somebody. Instead, she just nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she already knew. She told me that people around there have a rule they pass down. And the rule is simple. On that stretch of desert road after dark, you do not stop for anyone on foot. Not for anyone. She said it doesn't matter how normal they look or how much they seem to need help, because the ones who really need help don't end up out there in the first place. And she said the ones who stop, the kind-hearted ones, the ones who roll their window down, don't always come back. Then she told me I was lucky. Not because I'd escaped exactly, but because I'd figured out to get him out of the car before we reached wherever he was steering me. She said the ones who don't come back are the ones who keep driving, who keep believing the town is just a little farther, who let that patient voice in the passenger seat talk them all the way to the end of the road. She didn't say what was at the end of the road. I didn't ask. Some part of me knew I was better off not knowing. I finished my drive the next morning after sleeping a few hours in a motel with every light on and a chair pushed against the door. I made it to my new city, and I started my new job, and I built a whole new life there. And from the outside, everything looks completely normal. I go to work, I see friends, I do the things people do. But I sold that car within a month of arriving, took a loss on it, didn't care. I couldn't sit in the driver's seat without feeling that empty passenger seat next to me, without catching a whiff of dry earth that wasn't really there, without remembering that oversized handprint pressed into the glass from the inside. I still think about Walter, if that was ever even his name. I think about how he was clean when he should have been covered in dust, how he knew I was lying about my brother, how he told me it wasn't much farther in that soft, waiting voice. And most of all, I think about all the other drivers out there on long desert roads at night, tired and generous and alone, who are going to see a man walking on the shoulder someday and slow down to help. I hope they notice the dust. I hope they hear that quiet voice in the back of their head. And I hope when the man in the passenger seat asks if anyone knows where they are, that they lie better than I did, and that they figure out how to get him out before the town that never comes finally does. That's my story. It's the reason I fly everywhere now, even short trips, even when driving would be cheaper and easier. Some roads you only need to travel once to learn to stay off them for good. Story 3. I've never really told this whole thing to anyone. My wife knows bits of it, and I mentioned parts to my brother once when we'd both had a few beers, but I've never laid the whole night out from start to finish. I figured writing it down might help me stop turning it over in my head at 2 in the morning, so here it goes. My name is Wes. Back then I was 26 and pretty broke, and I'd just landed a job about 6 hours north of where I was living. Nothing fancy. It was a warehouse position. It paid a little better than what I had, and I needed the money, so I took it without thinking too hard. The plan was simple. I'd load up my old sedan, drive up the night before my first shift, crash at a cheap motel, and start fresh in the morning. I didn't have anybody to help me move because it was just me and a few boxes of clothes and a mattress I ended up leaving behind anyway. I left later than I wanted to. That was the first mistake, though at the time it didn't feel like a mistake at all. It just felt like me being me, running behind, grabbing a coffee and a bag of gas station snacks and hitting the road around 9 at night. The first couple hours were completely normal. I had a playlist going, the heater working just enough to keep me comfortable, and I remember feeling kind of good about the whole thing, like I was finally doing something with my life. The trouble was the road. My phone had me on the interstate for most of it, but somewhere around the halfway point there was construction, and the map rerouted me onto a smaller state road to skip the backup. I didn't think anything of it. I've taken back roads plenty of times. This one was 2 lanes, no lights except my own with tall pines crowding in on both sides like walls. The kind of dark where your headlights only reach so far and everything past that just doesn't exist. For a long while, it was peaceful, actually. I turned my music down because it felt loud against all that quiet outside. I passed a farmhouse here and there, a mailbox, an old church with a gravel lot. Normal country stuff. Then I noticed the headlights behind me. Now, I want to be clear about something, because this is the part people always want to skip past. A car behind you at night is not scary. It's the most ordinary thing in the world. I saw those lights in my mirror and my brain barely registered them. Somebody else was out here driving late too, that's all. Maybe heading home from a long shift. Maybe going the same direction I was for their own reasons. What made me look twice was the distance. They stayed pretty far back, farther than most people drive. And I only really started paying attention when I slowed down for a sharp curve and glanced up expecting them to close the gap a little. They didn't. They slowed down too, and they held that same exact space between us like it was measured out with a ruler. I told myself it was nothing. I really did. But I turned my music off completely after that. And I kept one eye on the mirror, and my hands were a little tighter on the wheel than they'd been a minute before. So there I was, driving through the middle of nowhere with a pair of headlights, sitting in my mirror, and I was doing that thing where you argue with yourself. Half of me was saying I was being ridiculous, that I'd been alone in the dark too long, and my imagination was filling in the gaps. The other half wouldn't shut up about how those lights hadn't moved from that same spot in what had to be 10 or 15 minutes by then. I decided to test it, not in any dramatic way. I just eased off the gas a little, let my speed drop from around 55 down to maybe 40. Nice and gradual, like I was tired or being careful. I watched the mirror the whole time. The lights got a little bigger for a few seconds, which made my stomach drop. But then they settled back. Whoever it was had slowed down to match me. Same gap, same patient distance. When you're behind somebody who's going too slow, the normal human thing's to get annoyed and pass them, or at least ride closer to pressure them. This person didn't either. They just adjusted and hung back like it was no trouble at all. I sped back up. They sped up. I told myself maybe they were just a nervous driver on an unfamiliar road, sticking behind the only other car around because it made them feel safer. That's a real thing people do. I've done it myself, honestly. Followed a truck through heavy fog because I couldn't see the lines. So I leaned on that idea and it calmed me down for a little while. Then I came up on a gas station. It was one of those small ones, just 2 pumps and a cinder block building with a flickering sign. But it was open, and there was a light on inside. And the second I saw it, I felt this wave of relief I wasn't expecting. I put my blinker on and pulled in, partly because I genuinely was getting low on gas, but mostly because I wanted to see what the car behind me would do. It kept going. The headlights slid right past the entrance and continued on down the road, and I watched the taillights shrink and disappear around a bend, and I actually laughed at myself out loud. Just a quiet little laugh, the kind you do when you realize you've been scaring yourself over nothing. A regular car, a regular person, going wherever they were going. I'd built a whole story in my head out of 2 headlights. I pumped my gas, and while I was standing there in the cold, I went inside to grab another coffee because I could feel the long day catching up to me. The guy behind the counter was older, maybe 60, with a flannel shirt and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He nodded at me, and I nodded back. I poured my coffee, paid, and I was about to leave when he said something that I didn't think much of in the moment, but that I've replayed 100 times since. He asked me which way I was headed. I told him north, up the state road. He kind of paused, looked at me a second longer than felt normal, and said, "You be careful on that stretch tonight. Gets lonely up there. Not much between here and the next town." I said something like, "Will do," and I left. Totally polite, totally forgettable. It was only later that the way he'd looked at me started to feel like a warning he didn't quite have the words for. I got back in my car, feeling a lot better than I had 10 minutes earlier. Coffee in the holder, tank full, that dumb little scare behind me. I pulled back onto the road and drove for a good while with the radio playing low again, and the whole nervous feeling had mostly drained out of me. I made it maybe 20 minutes before I saw them again. The headlights came up behind me the same way, appearing out of the dark, and at first my brain refused to accept it was the same car. There was no reason it should be. That car had passed me. It had driven off ahead of me and vanished. For it to be behind me now, it would have had to pull over somewhere up the road, wait in the dark with its lights off, and slide in behind me after I passed. And why would anybody do that? But there they were. And they settled into that exact same distance, that same measured gap, like they'd never left at all. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I didn't. My heart started going, and I felt this cold prickle spread across the back of my neck and down my arms, because now I couldn't explain it away. Now the two easy stories I'd been telling myself, the nervous driver, the coincidence, both of them fell apart at the same time, and I was left with the plain fact that a car had waited for me in the dark and gotten back behind me on purpose. I grabbed my phone off the passenger seat to look at where the next town was. 1 bar of service. It flickered to nothing, then came back to 1. I was still a long way from anywhere. Okay, so picture where my head was at. I've got 1 bar of service that keeps blinking out. I'm alone on a road with nothing but trees on both sides. And behind me is a car that just proved it was following me on purpose. That old easy feeling from the gas station was completely gone. My hands were sweating on the wheel, and I kept wiping them one at a time on my jeans. The first real decision I made was to not let them know I knew. I don't know where that instinct came from, but something in me said, don't slam on the brakes, don't do anything sudden, don't let on that you figured it out. So I kept driving at a normal speed, eyes forward mostly, sneaking glances at the mirror. I figured as long as they thought I hadn't noticed, they'd keep their distance. It was a small thing to hold on to, but I held on to it hard. I started thinking about my options, and none of them were good. Pulling over was out. The idea of stopping my car on a dark road and just sitting there while that thing rolled up behind me made my whole body go cold. Turning around was out too, because that would mean driving straight at them, and I didn't want to be any closer to that car than I already was. Speeding up felt pointless because they'd already shown they could match whatever I did. So I kept going, and I kept telling myself that a town had to be coming, that there'd be lights and people, and I'd be fine. I just had to reach it. Then the phone rang, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was my brother, Colton. He'd texted me earlier asking how the drive was going, and I guess he decided to call. I have never in my life been so happy to hear a phone. I answered on speaker, and I tried to sound normal, but he knew me too well, and about 10 seconds in, he goes, "You good? You sound weird." I told him. I kept my voice low and even, and I laid it out. The car, the gas station, how it had passed me and then come back. I remember he got real quiet while I talked. None of his usual joking, and when I finished, he asked me a couple of practical questions. How far to the next town? Whether the car had ever tried to pull up next to me. Whether I could read the plate. I couldn't read the plate. The headlights were too bright, and the car was too far back, and every time I stared at the mirror too long, I'd start to drift toward the shoulder, which scared me almost as much as the car did. Colton told me to stay on the line, that he was pulling up a map on his end, and hearing him tapping away at his computer through the speaker was maybe the only thing keeping me from falling apart. He found a town ahead of me. He said it looked like about 11 miles up, and that there was what looked like a police station or a sheriff's office right off the main road. 11 miles. That was the number I locked onto. 11 miles, and this was over. And then, while I was still on the phone, the car behind me did something new. It got closer. Not fast, not aggressive. It just slowly, smoothly closed some of that gap, cutting the distance between us in half over the span of maybe 30 seconds. Those headlights grew in my mirror until they were bright enough to light up the inside of my car, throwing the shadow of my own head onto the dashboard. I told Colton what was happening, and I heard the change in his voice too, that forced calm people use when they're actually really scared, but trying not to make it worse. He said, "Don't stop. Whatever you do, do not stop the car. Keep driving straight to that town." I said, "Okay." My voice cracked when I said it. The car stayed there. Closer now, close enough that I could see it wasn't a normal sedan like mine. It sat higher. Some kind of truck or SUV, dark-colored, though I couldn't tell you the make because the lights washed everything else out. It just held that spot right off my bumper, close but not touching, and there was something almost worse about that than if it had rammed me. It was so controlled, so patient, like whoever was driving had done this before and knew exactly how much room to give. I kept checking the odometer, counting down those 11 miles in my head, watching the numbers crawl. 8 miles, 7. The trees kept sliding past in the dark, and the headlights kept burning in my mirror, and Colton kept talking to me, just talking about anything, keeping me steady. And I kept my eyes on the road and my foot even on the gas, and I prayed to whatever was listening that I'd see a streetlight soon. Then, around the 6-mile mark, the truck flicked its high beams on. Those high beams turned the inside of my car white. It was like somebody had aimed a spotlight straight through my back window. My mirror became useless, just a rectangle of pure glare, and when I glanced up at it, I had to look away because it hurt my eyes. My whole dashboard lit up. My hands on the wheel lit up. For a second, I couldn't see the road ahead of me at all because my eyes had adjusted to that brightness, and everything past my hood went black. I heard Colton through the speaker asking what was happening, and I told him the guy had his brights on now, right on my tail, and I heard him say something under his breath that I won't repeat here. Then he said real firm, "Wes, listen to me. He's trying to get you to react. He wants you to panic and stop or pull over or crash. Don't give it to him. Just drive. You're almost there." I want to tell you I was brave. I wasn't. I was shaking. But I did the one thing that mattered, which was I kept driving. I reached up and flipped my mirror to the night setting so the glare wasn't stabbing me in the eyes anymore, and I fixed everything I had on the road in front of me, and I just drove. 50 miles an hour down a dark 2-lane road with a stranger's high beams flooding my car, counting off the distance out loud so Colton could hear me and so I could keep myself together. 5 miles. 4.5. The truck started doing this thing where it would drop back a little and then surge forward again, closing right up on my bumper before easing off. Over and over. Each time it surged, I'd feel my whole body clench up, waiting for the crunch of it hitting me, and each time it would pull up just short. I realized now it was playing with me, testing me, seeing if I'd break and do something stupid. And honestly, I came close. There was a moment where every instinct in my body was screaming to just stomp the brakes or yank the wheel onto the shoulder, and the only thing that stopped me was Colton's voice in my ear repeating the same thing over and over. "Don't stop. Don't stop. You're almost there." Around 3 miles out, I finally saw it, a glow on the horizon. Not bright, Just that soft orange smudge in the sky that means there are streetlights somewhere ahead, that there are people and buildings and businesses. I told Colton I could see the town, and I heard him let out this long breath, like he'd been holding it the whole time. And here's the part that still gets me. The second I said that, the second that town came into view, the truck backed off. Not all at once, but those high beams dropped down to normal, and the gap between us started to grow slow and smooth the same way it had closed. The truck fell back and back until it was just a pair of headlights in the distance again. And then I came around a curve and past a stand of trees, and when I looked in the mirror, the road behind me was empty. Just black. Like there'd never been anything there at all. I didn't trust it. I kept my speed up, and I kept checking the mirror the whole way into town, waiting for those lights to come roaring back. But they didn't. I passed the town limit sign, and then a gas station with its lights on. And then an actual street light, a real one. And I have never felt anything like the relief that hit me when that light passed over my car. I started crying a little, honestly, just from the release of it. Colton was still on the line, and he heard me, and he stayed quiet and let me have that moment. I found the sheriff's station Colton had spotted on the map. It was a small building, but there were lights on inside and a couple of cars in the lot. And I pulled in and parked right up by the door and just sat there for a minute, with my hands still gripping the wheel, trying to make them stop shaking. Colton made me promise to go inside and report it before we hung up. I promised. I meant it. I went in and told the deputy on duty everything. He was a younger guy, maybe a little older than me. And he listened to the whole thing and took notes, and he was kind about it, but I could tell there wasn't a whole lot he could do. I couldn't give him a plate. I couldn't give him a make or model beyond dark truck or SUV sits high. There was no crime he could point to exactly. The guy never touched my car, never showed a weapon. From a legal standpoint, a vehicle had driven behind mine on a public road with its high beams on. That's it. But then the deputy went quiet for a second, and he set his pen down. And he asked me which direction I come from. I told him. And the look that came over his face was the same look the old man at the gas station had given me. That look of somebody who knows something and isn't sure how to say it. The deputy leaned back in his chair and rubbed the back of his neck, and he took his time before he said anything, like he was deciding how much to tell me. Then he said that stretch of road had a bit of a history. Not in a dramatic way, not like some ghost story or urban legend, but in the plain way small town cops talk about things that keep happening. He said they'd taken a handful of reports over the last couple years that sounded a lot like mine. Drivers, usually alone, usually late at night, usually people passing through who weren't from around there. A dark truck, high beams, somebody who'd follow for miles at that same careful distance and then just peel off the second another town came into view. I asked him if they'd ever caught anybody. He said no. He said every report was the same as mine, no plate, no clear description, nothing to go on. The person, whoever it was, never made contact, never did anything you could actually charge. They just followed, and they scared people half to death, and then they vanished back into the dark before anybody could get close enough to see who they were or what they wanted. He said the reports always came from folks headed the same direction I'd been going, on that same lonely stretch, and always at night. And then he said, the thing that I think about the most, he said, whoever it is, they know that road better than we do. They know exactly where it opens up and where it doesn't. They know how far back to sit so you can't read them. And they always stop before the town. every single time, like they know exactly where our jurisdiction starts paying attention. He shook his head. That's the part that gets me. It's not somebody losing their temper or having a bad night. It's practiced. They've done it a lot. That word stuck with me. Practiced. Because he was right, and I'd felt it out there without having the word for it. The way that truck matched my every move. The way it closed the gap and backed off, closed and backed off. Testing me like it was running through a routine it had run 100 times before. It never felt like road rage. It never felt like some drunk kid messing around. It felt like a person doing something they were good at, something they'd worked out over a long time. And that's so much worse than someone just being angry. Anger burns out. Whatever that was didn't burn out. It made a choice, and it stuck to it for miles. And it only quit because the town got in the way. The deputy let me sit in the station lot for a while before I moved on. He even offered to have someone follow me to my motel, which I took him up on. And I don't feel one bit embarrassed about that. A cruiser trailed me the last few miles to the cheap place I'd booked, and I checked in with my hands still not quite steady, and I double-locked the door and sat on the edge of that scratchy motel bed until the sun came up. I never slept. I just watched the parking lot through a gap in the curtains, half expecting to see a dark truck roll through, though it never did. I started my new job the next morning, running on zero sleep and a lot of bad coffee, and I never told anybody there what had happened. It didn't seem like the kind of thing you bring up to coworkers you just met. I just showed up, did the work, and kept my mouth shut. But for the entire time I lived up there, almost 2 years, I never once drove that state road again, not even in daylight, not even when it would have saved me an hour. I'd take the long way around every time, the interstate the whole distance, adding miles and time just so I never had to see those trees again. I still don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted. And I've made a kind of peace with the fact that I never will. Maybe it was somebody who got a thrill out of scaring people. Maybe it was something worse, and I got lucky, and the town showed up before they finished whatever it was they'd started. I think about the people who came before me on that road, the other reports the deputy mentioned. And I think about the fact that all of them made it to a town too. And then I think about the ones who maybe didn't make it, who never filed a report because they never got the chance to. And that's where my mind stops itself, because I don't like where it goes. Colton and I still talk about it sometimes. He says I did everything right, that I kept my head, that I didn't stop. And I know he's right, but I also know how close I came to stopping. I know there was a moment out there where I almost gave that thing exactly what it wanted, and the only reason I didn't was a voice on a phone telling me to keep going. If he hadn't called when he did, if I'd been out there alone with no one in my ear, I honestly don't know how that night ends. So that's the whole thing, start to finish. That's why I don't take back roads at night anymore, why I fill up my tank before the sun goes down, why I get a little tense whenever a set of headlights sits too long in my mirror. Most of the time, it's nothing. Most of the time, it really is just somebody heading home from a long shift. But every now and then I catch myself easing off the gas just to see what they do. And I hope every single time that they pass me. Story 4. People always ask me why I don't drive at night if I can help it. And I usually just tell them I'm tired or I don't like the glare of oncoming traffic. That's the easy answer. The real answer is a stretch of desert highway I drove across about 4 years ago. And something I saw out there that I still can't fully explain. I'm going to try to write it all down the way it actually happened. No exaggerating, no adding stuff to make it scarier than it was. It was scary enough on its own. I go by Dean. At the time, I was 29, and I'd just gone through a rough breakup, the kind where you split the furniture and figure out you can't afford your apartment on one income. So I did what a lot of people do when their life falls apart. I decided to move. My buddy had a spare room out west and told me I could stay there while I got back on my feet. So I packed everything I owned into a rented cargo van and set out across the country by myself. Most of the trip was fine. Boring, even. Long days of flat highway and truck stop food and podcasts I stopped paying attention to hours ago. I'd been on the road 3 days by the time I hit the part of the country where the towns get real far apart and the land goes empty in every direction. Desert country. The kind of place where you can see the road running dead straight all the way to the horizon, and there's nothing on either side but scrub brush and dirt and mountains way off in the distance that never seem to get any closer. I planned to stop for the night at a motel, but I got a late start that day, and I was behind schedule. And I made the call to just push through and drive into the night to make up time. The van was slow and heavy, loaded down with all my stuff, but the road was empty and straight. And I figured I'd just put on some music and grind out a few more hours before I found somewhere to sleep. The sun went down somewhere out there, and it was like a switch got flipped. 1 minute there was that orange light stretching across everything, and the next it was just gone, and the dark that came after was darker than anything I was used to. No city glow, no other headlights, just my own beams cutting a little tunnel into the black and the white line ticking past on my left. I remember the temperature dropping fast the way it does in the desert, and I turned the heat on and felt that quiet settle in around me. Here's the thing about driving alone in that kind of dark. You start to feel really small. Your whole world shrinks down to the little bit of road your headlights can reach, and everything past that just becomes this big nothing pressing in on all sides. I'd never experienced anything like it. Back home, there's always some light somewhere. A house, a street lamp, a plane going over. Out there, it was just me and the van and the road. And after a while, it started to mess with my head a little. The way total silence and total dark do. I'd been driving in that for maybe an hour when I saw the light out in the desert. It was way off to my right. Out in the flat, nothing beyond the shoulder. A single point of light. Kind of pale. Kind of steady. My first thought was a house. Somebody living way out in the middle of nowhere. Which happens. But as I kept driving and kept watching it in my side vision, something about it started to bother me. It wasn't in a fixed spot the way a house would be. It seemed to be keeping pace with me, staying off to my right at about the same distance, sliding along out there in the dark at the exact same speed I was going. I told myself it was an optical illusion. Your eyes play tricks in the dark, especially when you're tired. And a far-off light can look like it's moving when it's really you that's moving. I've had that happen with the moon plenty of times, where it feels like it's following the car. So I decided that's what it was, some distant thing out on the flats that just looked like it was matching me, and I tried to put it out of my mind. But I kept glancing over at it, and it kept pace with me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't as far away as I wanted it to be. I want to explain something about that light before I go on, because it matters. When you're out in real dark, judging distance is almost impossible. There's nothing to measure against. No trees, no buildings, no other cars. So a light out in the desert could be a mile away, or it could be 100 yards away, and you honestly can't tell. That was part of what made it so unsettling. I kept trying to figure out how far off it was, and my eyes just couldn't do it. It floated out there in the black with nothing around it, and my brain kept guessing and never landing on an answer. For a while, I did the thing where you just refused to look. I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead and told myself if I stopped feeding it attention, it would turn out to be nothing. And that worked for a few minutes. But you know how it is when you're trying not to look at something. It pulls at you. And every time I gave in and glanced right, there it was, pale and steady, gliding along out in the flats at my exact speed. So I decided to test it, in the same way you might test anything you're not sure about. I slowed the van down, not a lot, just eased off the gas and let my speed bleed off by 15 or 20. And I watched the light. It slowed down, too. I felt this cold drop in my stomach when it happened. But I wasn't ready to believe it yet, so I told myself. Maybe I'd imagined the change. Maybe it was still moving and I just thought it slowed. So I sped back up, got the van moving good again, and the light picked up speed right along with me and settled back into that same spot off my right side. There was no more pretending it was the moon or a trick of my tired eyes. Something out in that desert was watching what I did and matching it on purpose. My mind started throwing out explanations, because that's what minds do when they're scared. They reach for anything normal to hold on to. Maybe it was another vehicle on some dirt road that ran parallel to the highway, I thought. That would explain it keeping pace, some rancher or a local driving home on a back trail I couldn't see. That actually made me feel a little better for a minute. A person in a truck out on a dirt road going the same way I was going. No big deal. But then I really looked at the light, and that explanation fell apart. A vehicle would have two headlights, or at least it would look like headlights, low to the ground and yellowish and bouncing a little over rough terrain. This was one single light, and it was pale, more white than yellow, and it didn't bounce or shake at all. It just floated, smooth and level, like it was gliding a few feet off the ground with nothing under it. And there was no dust behind it, no engine sound carrying across the flats, no sense of a machine out there at all. Just that one pale light moving through the dark like it weighed nothing. I rolled my window down a crack to listen, thinking maybe I'd hear an engine and it would all click into place, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the hum of my own tires and that huge desert silence. And the cold air that came in was so still and so quiet that I put the window back up fast, because somehow the silence out there was worse than any sound would have been. I checked my phone. No service, obviously. I'd lost it hours ago and hadn't gotten it back. I looked at my gas gauge, and it was a little under half, which was fine, but the sight of it made me think about how far I was from anything. How there'd been no exit, no town, no gas station. Nothing at all for a long time now. Just this one straight road and me on it, and that light out in the dark, keeping me company whether I wanted it to or not. I did the math in my head about how long I'd been driving since the last sign of civilization, and it scared me how big the number was. I hadn't passed another car in probably 40 minutes. I hadn't seen a light other than that one in even longer. It really sank in then, how completely alone I was. If something happened out here, if I broke down, if that light out there was something I needed to get away from, there was no one. No one would drive by. No one would hear me. It was just me. And that's about when the light started to get closer. It didn't rush at me or anything like that. If it had, I think I might have handled it better, because at least that would have been something I could react to. Instead, it just closed the distance slow, So slow that at first I wasn't even sure it was happening. I'd look over and think it seemed a little bigger, then tell myself I was imagining it, then look again a couple of minutes later, and it would be a little bigger still. Bit by bit, the pale light out in the desert was drifting in toward the road, toward me. I did the only thing that made sense to me at the time, which was drive faster. I pushed that loaded down van as hard as it would go, watching the speedometer climb higher than I'd normally ever take it on a road like that, especially in the dark. The whole van shook and the engine got loud and my stuff shifted around in the back, and I gripped the wheel with both hands and just tried to outrun it. The light kept pace, effortless. Whatever speed I hit, it matched, and it kept drifting in closer while it did. And now I could see it better than I wanted to. It was still just a single point of pale light. But as it got nearer, I started to get a sense of how big it actually was, and it was small. Smaller than a car, smaller than a person even. It was like a light about the size of a lantern, just floating along a few feet above the desert floor, keeping pace with a van going way too fast. And there was nothing holding it up and nothing behind it, and no sound coming off it at all. I need you to understand that up to this point, I'd been telling myself stories. A house, the moon, a truck on a back road. My brain kept trying to hand me something normal to believe. But watching that little pale light glide along beside me at 70-something miles an hour, level and silent and impossible, I ran out of stories. There was no version of the normal world that explained what I was looking at. And that's a strange kind of fear. When your mind gives up trying to make sense of a thing and just accepts that it's real and it's wrong and it's right there. I eased off the gas because I was genuinely scared the van was going to shake apart or I was going to lose control. And as soon as I slowed down, the light slowed too, and it kept coming in closer. And now it was maybe just off the shoulder, close enough that its pale glow was touching the edge of my headlight's reach, close enough that I could see it wasn't casting light on anything around it. That was the detail that really got me. A light that bright should have lit up the ground under it, the brush around it, something. But the desert around that glow stayed pitch black, like the light only existed for itself and gave nothing to anything else. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I started talking to myself out loud just to have a human voice in that van, saying things like, "Keep driving, keep going, you're fine, keep going." I don't know if I believed it, but saying it helped a little. And then the light did something that made my whole body go cold in a way I'd never felt before. It moved out ahead of me. It picked up speed, smooth and steady, and it pulled forward from beside the van until it was out in front of me, still off to the right, but ahead now, and it started drifting toward the center of the road, toward my lane. It was moving to get in front of the van, to be in the road ahead of me, and everything in me understood that I did not want that light in front of me. I did not want to drive up on it. I did not want to be anywhere near it. I had a choice to make in about 2 seconds. I could slam on the brakes and stop alone, in the dark, with that thing right there. Or I could keep going and pass it, drive right past that pale, floating light at speed, and hope it stayed on the shoulder, and hope I never had to know what it really was. I kept my foot on the gas. I aimed the van down the center of the road, as far from the right shoulder as I could get without going into the other lane, and I drove straight at the spot where that light was hanging in the dark, and I did not slow down. The last few seconds before I reached it stretched out the way time does when you're terrified. The light hung there just off the right edge of the road, pale and steady, and I came at it in the center of my lane with both hands locked on the wheel and my foot flat on the floor, And I made myself keep my eyes forward and not stare at it, because some part of me was scared that if I looked right at it, something would happen. I don't know what. I just knew I didn't want to look. But you can't not look at something like that when you're passing right beside it. As the van drew even with the light, I turned my head, just for a second, because I had to. I had to see. And there was nothing there. That's the part I still can't get past. The light was hanging in the air maybe 10 feet off the shoulder, glowing pale and even. And around it, and under it, and behind it, there was just empty desert. No pole, no wire, no body, no animal, no person, no machine. Nothing at all holding it up or standing near it. Just a light floating in the black by itself. And as I passed it, I saw that it didn't have a shape exactly. It wasn't a bulb or a lantern like I'd been picturing. It was more like a smudge of pale glow, soft at the edges, about the size of a basketball, and it hung there in the dark with no source and no reason and no explanation that any part of my brain could offer. I passed it. The van blew by at speed, and I whipped my eyes back to the road, and I braced for something. Though I couldn't have told you what. A sound. A pull on the wheel. Something reaching for me. But there was nothing. The van kept going straight and true, and the road kept running out ahead into the dark. And for a second, I let myself think I'd made it, that I'd driven past the thing and left it behind, and now I could just keep going until I found a town. Then I checked my mirror, and the light was in the road behind me. It had moved into my lane, dead center, and it was following, not drifting off to the side anymore. Not keeping pace out in the flats. It was right there on the road behind the van, hanging at about the height of my back window. And it was coming after me. It moved smooth and level like it had the whole time. No bouncing, no shaking. Just gliding along the center line in my mirror, matching my speed. And something about seeing it directly behind me instead of off to the side was so much worse. It felt like it had made a decision. Like the game of pacing me out in the desert was over, and now it was just chasing. I lost it a little at that point. I'm not going to pretend I stayed calm. I started driving worse than I ever have in my life, taking that van up over 90 on a dark desert road, drifting over the center line and jerking back, watching the mirror more than the road, which is a good way to get yourself killed. The light stayed behind me the whole time. Every time I looked up, it was there. That same pale smudge, holding its distance, following me down the center of the road like it had all the time in the world and knew I couldn't keep this up forever. And it was right. I couldn't. The engine was screaming, and the whole van was shuddering, and I knew if I hit a bump or a curve at that speed, I was done. So I forced myself to ease off, to bring the speed down to something survivable. And the second I did, the light closed in a little, cutting the gap between us, staying right on me. I brought my speed down more, and it came closer still until it was hanging just off my back bumper, that pale glow filling up my rear window and lighting the inside of the van with a dim, sickly kind of light that made my own hands look strange and gray on the wheel. I have never wanted to see another human being so badly in my life. A gas station, a house, a single other set of headlights. Anything at all that meant I wasn't the only living thing out in that dark with whatever was behind me. And I remembered what happened to me the last time I was scared like this, on a different road years back. How it was the sight of a town that finally made the thing behind me leave. So I started praying for lights. I started begging out loud for a town, an exit, anything. My voice cracking and shaking as I stared down that empty black road, hoping and hoping to see a glow on the horizon. And after what felt like forever, far up ahead, so faint I almost didn't trust it, I saw one. At first, I didn't let myself believe it. I'd been staring into that black so long that my eyes had started inventing things, little flickers and shapes that weren't there, and I figured the glow up ahead was just another one of those. But I kept driving toward it, and it didn't disappear the way the fake ones did. It got bigger. It got steadier. And after a minute or two, I could tell it was real. A spread of pale light low on the horizon, the kind of glow that means buildings and street lamps and people. A town. An actual town out there in all that nothing. I checked my mirror and the light was still behind me, still hanging off my bumper, still filling the van with that dim gray glow. It hadn't backed off at all yet. And I remember this awful stretch of a few minutes where I was watching the town get closer in front of me and the light staying right on me behind me, and I honestly didn't know which one would win. I didn't know if reaching the town would matter to this thing the way it had mattered to the truck years before. Maybe this was different. Maybe this one didn't care about towns or lights or people. Maybe it would follow me right down the main street. The first real streetlight came up on my right, and I passed under it, and the town started to take shape around me. A gas station. Closed for the night, but with its sign still lit. A row of little buildings, a stop sign, which I rolled straight through because there was no way I was slowing down. And I kept checking my mirror the entire time, waiting to see what the light would do. It stopped at the edge of town. Right around where the first streetlight was, the light behind me slowed and fell back, and I watched it stop in the road behind me, hanging there in the dark, just past the reach of that street lamp's glow. It didn't come any further. It just held its place at the town's edge, that pale smudge sitting in the middle of the empty road. And as I drove deeper into town, it got smaller and smaller in my mirror, until a building blocked it from view. And when I came around the next corner and looked back, it was gone. I drove straight to the gas station, even though it was closed, because it was lit and it felt safe. And I pulled the van up under the lights and put it in park and just sat there. My whole body was shaking. My shirt was soaked through with sweat, even though the night was cold. I sat under those gas station lights for probably an hour, not moving, watching the road I'd come in on, waiting to see if that pale glow would come drifting into town after me. It never did. When it got light out, I found a diner that had just opened, and I went in and ordered coffee and sat in a booth by the window where I could see my van. The waitress was an older woman, and I guess I looked as rough as I felt, because she asked if I was okay. And I don't know what came over me, but I told her. Not all of it, but enough. I told her I'd driven in late on the highway from the east, and that I'd seen something out in the desert, a light that followed me. And I asked her if that meant anything to her. She got quiet. She topped off my coffee, and she didn't say anything for a second. And then she said that people who drove that road at night sometimes talked about lights out in the flats. She said the old-timers had names for them, that they'd been part of the local stories for as long as anyone could remember, and that the advice folks around there gave was pretty simple. Don't drive that road after dark, and if you see a light out in the desert, don't slow down, don't stop, and whatever you do, don't follow it. She said the ones who followed the lights were the ones you didn't hear from again. I asked her if that was true, or if it was just a story people told. She kind of smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile, and she said it didn't much matter whether it was true. What mattered was that everyone local knew to stay off that road at night, and the only people who ever saw the lights were folks passing through who didn't know any better. Folks like me. I finished my coffee, and I got a room at a little motel in that town. And I slept the whole day, And when I finally got back on the road, I made absolutely sure I'd reached my buddy's place before dark. I never drove at night for the rest of that trip, and I've mostly kept it up since. I'll drive at night in the city, where there's light and traffic and other people. But you will not catch me alone on some empty highway after the sun goes down. Not ever again. I've tried to explain that light to myself 1,000 times since then. Swamp gas, some people say, though there's no swamp out in the desert. Ball lightning, headlights bending over the horizon. A reflection. My tired brain making things up. I've heard every rational explanation there is, and I've wanted to believe all of them. But none of them account for a light that matched my speed, that closed in when I slowed, that moved into the road to get in front of me and then followed me from behind for miles and stopped, deliberately, right at the edge of town. None of them explain a glow that gave off no light to anything around it. That wasn't gas or lightning or reflection. That was something that knew I was there. So that's my story. That's why I don't do desert highways at night, why I'd rather stop early and lose the time than push through in the dark, why I get a knot in my stomach anytime I see a single light off in the distance where a light shouldn't be. Most of the time, it's nothing, a radio tower, a far-off farm. But I never assume anymore. I just keep my eyes on the road and I keep driving, and I never, ever slow down to get a better look. Story 5. I work in insurance now, a nice safe desk job, and my co-workers think I'm the most cautious person they've ever met. I plan everything. I check the weather 3 times before any drive. I never let my gas tank get below half. They tease me about it, and I just laugh it off, but the truth is, there's a reason I got this way, and it goes back to one hitchhiker I picked up on a mountain road when I was young and stupid and thought nothing bad could happen to me. My name's Reed. When I was 23, I had this romantic idea about being a person who did spontaneous things. And one October, I decided I was going to drive up into the mountains by myself to see the fall colors. No plan, no reservations, just me and my car and a cooler of sandwiches and whatever roads looked interesting. Looking back, it was exactly the kind of trip that sounds great in your head and works out fine 99 times out of 100. This was the one time it didn't. The first day was honestly perfect. The leaves were turning, all these deep reds and golds coming down the mountainsides, and I drove these winding 2-lane roads with the windows cracked and cold, clean air coming in. And I felt free in a way I hadn't in a long time. I stopped at little overlooks and took pictures. I ate lunch on the hood of my car looking out over a valley. It was the kind of day that makes you feel like your dumb, spontaneous idea was actually brilliant. By late afternoon, I was deep into the mountains, way off the main routes, on these narrow roads that twisted along the sides of ridges, with steep drops on one side and rock walls on the other. I hadn't seen another car in a while, which didn't worry me at the time. It just felt peaceful. The sun was getting low and throwing long shadows through the trees, and I figured I'd drive another hour or so and then find somewhere to stay for the night. Maybe a little town with a motel. That was when I saw the guy walking on the side of the road. He was up ahead on the right, walking the same direction I was driving, and my first reaction was just surprise, because I hadn't expected to see a single soul out there. He had a backpack on, and he was walking with his head down. And as I got closer, he heard my engine and turned around and stuck his thumb out. A hitchhiker. Now, I know what everybody says about picking up hitchhikers. I'd heard it all, too. But I was 23, and I thought I was a good judge of people. And it was getting cold and starting to get dark, and there was this guy out in the middle of nowhere on foot, miles from anything. And it just felt wrong to leave him. He looked normal. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He looked completely normal. Regular clothes, regular backpack, a friendly kind of face. Maybe a few years older than me. So I slowed down and pulled over. He jogged up to the car, and I rolled the passenger window down, and he leaned in and thanked me and asked if I could take him up the road a ways. He said his truck had broken down a few miles back, and there was a town ahead where he could get help. It all sounded reasonable. His voice was calm and friendly, so I told him to hop in. And he took his backpack off and set it in the back seat and climbed in front. And I pulled back onto the road, and for the first few minutes, everything was completely fine. He told me his name, which I won't share here for reasons that'll make sense later, and we made small talk. Where I was from, where he was headed, how pretty the leaves were. He was easy to talk to, friendly, and I remember feeling good about my decision, feeling like I'd done a nice thing for somebody who needed it. Then I noticed his backpack in my mirror, sitting on the back seat, and I saw that the bottom of it was dark and wet, and something about the color of it made my good feelings start to drain away. I told myself it was water. That's the honest first thought I had. The guy had been walking on the side of a mountain road. Maybe he'd crossed a stream. Maybe his water bottle had leaked inside the bag. There are 100 ways a backpack gets wet, and none of them are sinister. So I looked back at the road and tried to let it go, but my eyes kept going up to that mirror. I couldn't help it. And the more I looked, the less it seemed like water. Water spreads out and looks clear or gray. This was dark. It had soaked into the bottom of the bag and gone a deep reddish brown, and there was a little bit of it that had gotten onto my seat where the bag was resting, a small dark smear on the fabric. And I know now what I was looking at. Or I'm pretty sure I do. But at the time, my brain just kept flinching away from the obvious answer, the way it does when the obvious answer is too much to deal with. I kept up the small talk because I didn't know what else to do. I asked him easy questions and nodded at his answers, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was watching him out of the corner of my eye now, noticing things I hadn't noticed before. There was dirt on his hands, ground into the knuckles, and something darker under his fingernails. There was a smell in the car that I'd blamed on the outdoors when he first got in. A heavy, earthy smell, but with the windows up, it had gotten stronger, and it wasn't the smell of leaves or dirt. It was something else, something that turned my stomach in a way I couldn't put words to. He must have felt the mood in the car change because he got a little quieter, too. And that made it worse because now we were both just sitting there in this silence that had gone from comfortable to tense, and I was very aware that I was alone in a car on an empty mountain road with a stranger, and that no one on earth knew where I was. I hadn't told anybody my route because I didn't have a route. I'd been so proud of being spontaneous. And now that spontaneity meant that if something happened to me out here, it might be a very long time before anyone even started looking. I decided I needed to get him out of my car. I didn't have a plan for how exactly. I just knew that whatever was in that backpack and whatever was under his fingernails, I didn't want to be alone with it for 1 mile longer than I had to. So I started thinking about how to do it without setting him off. Because the other thing I'd figured out was that I did not want this man to know I was scared. Something told me that if he realized I'd noticed the bag, things would go bad fast. So I did what I do, I guess. I made a plan. I said, real casual, that I was actually getting pretty low on gas and I was going to need to stop at the next station, and that if he wanted, I could drop him right there, and he could probably get help from whoever was working. I tried to say it like I was doing him a favor, like it was all very normal and helpful. And I watched his face out of the corner of my eye when I said it. He didn't like it. He didn't say he didn't like it. But I saw something cross his face, this little flicker. And then he said, in the same friendly voice as before, that there wasn't a gas station for a long way yet, that he knew these roads, and that the town he was headed to was still a good while up ahead. He said it in a way that was meant to sound helpful, but underneath it I heard something else. I heard him telling me that I wasn't going to be stopping, that I was going to keep driving up this road into the dark, into the mountains, as far as he wanted to go. And that's when the fear really settled into me. Not a jump of fear, but a slow, cold weight in my chest, because I understood that I made a serious mistake, and that I was in a situation I didn't know how to get out of, and that the friendly man beside me was not friendly at all, and that we both knew it now, even though neither of us had said a single true thing out loud. The sun was almost gone. The shadows had turned into full dark under the trees, and up ahead the road just kept twisting deeper into the mountains, away from everything. And he was watching me now. I could feel it, watching to see what I'd do. I kept both hands on the wheel, and I kept my eyes forward, and I tried to think. Really think. The way you do when panic is right there at the edge of everything, and you know that if you let it in, you're finished. I had to stay calm. I had to keep him believing that I hadn't figured anything out, that I was just a friendly guy giving him a ride, even though I was pretty sure he knew better, and I was pretty sure I knew better, and the whole car was thick with everything we weren't saying. First thing I did was take stock of what I had. My phone was in the center console, but I'd already seen there was no service up here, no bars at all, so it was useless for calling anyone. My door was unlocked. His door was unlocked. I was driving, which meant I had some control, but not much, because the road was so narrow and twisty that I couldn't go fast, and there was a rock wall on one side and a drop on the other, so it wasn't like I could just floor it and get away. And he was bigger than me, sitting right next to me, close enough to grab the wheel, close enough to grab me if it came to that. So I couldn't outrun him, and I couldn't outmuscle him. What I had was that he didn't know I knew. That was the only card in my hand, and I decided I had to play it as long as I possibly could. And I had to use it to get myself somewhere with other people, before he decided the game was over. I started talking again. I made myself sound relaxed, even a little cheerful. And I asked him more about the town up ahead, playing dumb, acting like I'd accepted that we were driving there together, and I was fine with it. I asked what the town was called, whether it had a diner, whether he'd been there before, and I watched him relax a little as I did it, watched him decide that maybe I hadn't noticed anything after all, that I really was just some clueless kid giving him a lift. Every bit of tension I could pull out of him made me feel a little safer, because a relaxed man is a man who isn't about to do something. While I kept him talking, my eyes were scanning everything. Every bend in the road, every sign, anything at all. And after a few minutes of this, I saw something up ahead that made my heart lift, though I was careful not to show it. A road sign. A small green one. The kind that tells you a town is coming. And under the name was a number. 9 miles. 9 miles to somewhere with a name, which meant somewhere with buildings and people, and maybe a phone that worked. 9 miles. I locked onto that number. I just had to keep this man calm and keep this car on the road for 9 more miles. But here's where it got harder, because he'd seen the sign too. And a minute after we passed it, he said, real casual, that actually I could just let him out up ahead, that there was a trail he needed to get to and it was coming up on the right, and I didn't need to take him all the way to town after all. He said it lightly, helpfully, but I understood exactly what it meant. He didn't want to go into a town where there were people. He wanted me to stop this car out here in the dark, in the middle of nowhere, where it would be just the two of us, and whatever he had planned. I said sure, no problem, that I'd let him out at his trail. And then I did the thing that I think might have saved my life. I didn't stop. As we came up on the spot where he pointed, this dark little gap in the trees on the right, I eased off the gas like I was going to pull over, and I even put my blinker on. Made a whole show of getting ready to stop. And then, at the last second, I said, all apologetic, that there was a car coming up behind us, and I didn't want to stop right on the curve because it wasn't safe. And I'd just pull over a little further up where there was more room. There was no car behind us. The road was black and empty in my mirror. But he couldn't be sure of that without turning all the way around to look. And by the time he might have, I'd already passed his trail and kept driving, still talking, still friendly, still finding one more reason why this wasn't quite the right spot to stop. That trick bought me maybe a mile, but I could feel it wearing thin. He'd gone quiet again, and it was a different kind of quiet than before, a watchful, deciding kind of quiet. He was working something out in his head, and I had a horrible feeling I knew what it was. He was realizing that I kept finding reasons not to stop, that every spot he picked, I had an excuse. And a man like that doesn't stay fooled forever. Sooner or later, he was going to stop asking me to pull over and start making me. I kept the friendly patter going, but it was getting harder, because my mouth was dry and my voice wanted to shake, and I had to fight to keep it level. I asked him another question about the town, and he didn't answer. He just looked out the windshield at the dark road. And then, without turning his head, he said something that I've never forgotten. He said, real quiet, "You can stop being scared. I'm not going to hurt you if you just do what I say." And that was it. The pretending was over. He'd said it out loud, and there was no walking it back. No way for either of us to act like this was still a friendly ride. My hands went cold on the wheel, and my heart started going so hard, I could feel it in my throat. But somewhere in the middle of all that terror, there was one clear thought, and the thought was, I am not stopping this car. No matter what he says, no matter what he does, I am not taking my foot off this gas and until there are other people around. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. I just kept driving. And he must have taken my silence as me getting ready to obey, because he told me to slow down, that there was a spot up ahead. And he lifted his hand off his knee, and I saw him reach toward the backpack in the back seat, reaching for whatever was inside it, and every alarm in my body went off at once. Up ahead, the road came around a long curve, and as I took it, I saw lights, real lights. Down the mountain and off to the left, a scatter of them, warm and yellow, the lights of a town in the valley below, still a couple of miles off, but there, unmistakably there, and closer, much closer. Right at the bottom of the curve I was coming down, I saw something even better, a gas station, lit up, open, with a couple of cars in the lot and the glow of fluorescent lights inside, and a person, an actual person, standing out by the pumps. I have never made a decision so fast in my life. I didn't slow down for his spot. I aimed the car straight for that gas station, and I pushed the gas down and took that curve faster than I should have. And he felt it. He felt me speeding up toward the lights, and he said, my mistake, out loud. He said, "What are you doing?" And his hand came off the backpack and grabbed for the wheel. But I was ready for it. I'd been waiting for it. I jerked the wheel just enough to throw him off balance, and I laid on the horn, holding it down, a long, steady blast of it, echoing off the mountains, and I came flying down into that gas station lot with my horn blaring and my lights flashing where I hit the brights. And the guy at the pumps spun around and stared, and another person came to the window of the little store inside. The hitchhiker knew it was over. The second there were eyes on us, real witnesses, other people, he changed completely. He let go of the wheel. He grabbed his backpack out of the back seat, and before I'd even fully stopped the car, he had his door open, and he was out. And he was walking fast across the lot and away into the dark at the edge of the light. Not running, just walking quick with his head down, disappearing into the trees beyond the station, like he'd never been there at all. I skidded to a stop right next to the pumps, half-crooked, and I threw my car into park, and I just about fell out of the door, and the guy who'd been pumping gas came over asking if I was okay. And I couldn't even talk at first. I just pointed at the trees where the hitchhiker had gone and tried to get the words out. The man from the pumps helped me inside, and the woman working the register got me a cup of water and let me sit down on a stool behind the counter, and it took me a while before I could explain any of it. When I finally got the story out about the hitchhiker and the wet backpack and what he'd said and how he'd grabbed the wheel, they both went quiet and looked at each other in a way I didn't like. The woman picked up the phone and called the county sheriff, and while we waited, she locked the front doors, which I was grateful for, because I kept staring out at that dark line of trees where the man had gone, half expecting to see him come back into the light. The deputy who showed up was an older guy, calm, the kind of person who's seen a lot, and doesn't rattle easy. He took my statement, and he walked out to my car with a flashlight and looked at the passenger seat, at the dark stain the backpack had left on the fabric. And I watched his face change when he saw it. He got a swab from his kit and took a sample of it, real careful, and bagged it. And he asked me a lot of questions about the man, what he looked like, what he was wearing, everything he'd said. I told him all of it. Then the deputy asked where exactly I'd picked the guy up, and I described the stretch of road as best I could. The curve, the drop on one side, roughly how far back it had been. And when I described it, he got very still. He asked me to describe it again, and I did, and he wrote it all down, and then he stepped away and got on his radio and talked to somebody in a low voice for a couple of minutes where I couldn't hear. When he came back, he didn't tell me much. He said they'd had some trouble in that area. He said there'd been a report of a person gone, missing, not far from where I'd picked the man up. Someone whose vehicle had been found abandoned on that road a day or two earlier. He was careful with his words, the way cops are when they don't want to say more than they should, but I understood what he was telling me. He was telling me that the wet stain in that backpack and the dirt under that man's fingernails and the smell in my car probably had something to do with whoever was missing. And I understood that if I had stopped where the man wanted me to stop, out there in the dark with no one around, I would very likely have become the next report, the next abandoned car, the next name. They kept me at that gas station for hours while more officers came and went. At some point, they took my car to process it, and someone drove me to a motel in the town down in the valley, the same warm yellow lights I'd seen from the curve. I didn't sleep. I sat up with the lights on, and the chair pushed against the door until the sun came up. They never caught him. That's the part that still bothers me most, all these years later. I gave them everything I had, the description, the things he'd said, the direction he'd walked off in. And they searched those woods, and they never found him. He walked out of the light at that gas station and into the trees, and he was just gone, back into those mountains that he'd told me he knew so well. Every so often, for years afterward, I'd wonder if he was still out there, still walking those roads at dusk with his thumb out and his friendly face, waiting for the next person who thought they were a good judge of character. I found out later from following the news that they did eventually connect that missing person's case to some remains found in that general area, though they never named a suspect, and it never got fully solved as far as I know. I don't know for certain that the man I picked up was involved, but I know what I saw in that backpack, and I know what he said to me, and I know the way he changed the second there were other people watching. And I know that I got out of that car alive and someone else, somewhere back on that mountain, didn't. So that's how I turned into the careful person my coworkers make fun of. That's why I plan everything, why I always tell someone my route, why I'll never in my life pick up a stranger on an empty road, no matter how cold it is or how friendly they look, no matter how bad I feel leaving them there. Friendly is exactly what he looked like. And that's the whole point. The dangerous ones don't look dangerous. They look like a guy who needs a ride standing on the shoulder as the sun goes down, and by the time you notice the thing that's wrong, you've already let them into your car. I got lucky. I made a stupid decision, and I got lucky. And I've spent a long time being grateful for that gas station and those lights and the people who were standing in them. If that curve had gone on even one more mile before those lights showed up, I don't think I'd be here to write any of this down. The radio call that changed everything came at 4:17 in the morning, and it was a voice I knew asking for help that hadn't been requested. I remember the exact time because I wrote it in my log the way I wrote down everything, and that log is one of the few pieces of proof I have that any of this really happened. My name is Kevin, and back then I was a ranger at a mountain park in the western part of the country, the kind of place with high peaks and deep valleys and stretches of wilderness so remote that if you got hurt out there, help could be a full day away, if it came at all. I worked the night shift a lot, which most rangers hate, but I liked. The park was mine at night, quiet, still, just me and the radio and the occasional call about a raccoon in a cooler or a camper who'd had too much to drink. Night shift was boring, and in that job, boring is good. Boring means nobody's dying. So when the radio came alive at 4:17 that morning, I was half asleep in my chair at the ranger station, and it took me a second to shake myself awake and grab it. The voice on the other end was a ranger named Marcus. Marcus worked the same park I did, a good guy, solid, been there longer than me, and he was calling for backup. He said he was up at a trailhead near the north face, that he'd found an abandoned vehicle and signs of a possible injured hiker, and he needed a second ranger to come help him search. He gave me the location, clear as anything, and asked me to head up right away. Now I want to explain why my stomach turned cold the moment I heard his voice, because it wasn't the request itself. Backup calls happen. The reason my blood ran cold was that Marcus was off that week. He told me himself 3 days earlier that he was driving down to the coast to visit his sister and wouldn't be back until the following Monday. He was supposed to be 400 miles away, sitting on a beach. I keyed the radio and I asked him, careful, whether he wasn't supposed to be at his sister's. There was a pause, just a beat too long. And then Marcus laughed, that same easy laugh I'd heard 100 times, and he said plans changed, that his sister had to cancel, that he'd picked up a shift instead, and here he was, which was a perfectly reasonable explanation. People's plans change all the time, but something about that pause stuck with me. And something about the laugh. It was Marcus's laugh, exactly, and yet it landed wrong. The way a song sounds wrong when it's played back just slightly too slow. I told him I was on my way, because what else was I going to do? A fellow ranger was calling for help with a possible injured hiker. That's the whole job. You go. You don't sit at the station second, guessing a man's laugh while somebody might be bleeding out on a mountain. I grabbed my kit, got in the truck, and started up the service road toward the north face. It was maybe a 40-minute drive, most of it on rough, unpaved switchbacks that hugged the side of the mountain. The kind of road you take slow even in daylight, and this was pitch dark. That deep mountain dark where your headlights feel like they're the only light in the entire world. About halfway up, I tried to raise Marcus on the radio again, just to check in, let him know my progress. He answered right away. But this time, when I asked how the injured hiker was doing, whether he'd made contact, he said something that didn't fit. He said he was still waiting on me at the trailhead and hadn't started searching yet, because protocol said to wait for backup, which would have been fine, except 2 minutes earlier, in his first call, he told me he'd already found signs of the hiker and needed help searching. Now he was saying he hadn't started. Small thing. Easy to explain. Maybe I misheard the first time. Maybe he meant he'd seen signs but hadn't begun the actual search. I told myself all of that. But I slowed the truck down anyway without really deciding to. Some part of me, some older, deeper part that doesn't use words, had started tapping the brakes before my brain caught up to why. I kept climbing toward the north face, toward Marcus, toward the trailhead. And the whole way up, I had the strangest feeling that I was driving toward something that was wearing my friend's voice like a coat it had found and put on because it fit. The trailhead near the north face was a small gravel lot carved into the side of the mountain, just big enough for maybe 6 or 7 cars with a wooden information board at one end and a trail sign pointing up toward the peak. When my headlights swept across it, I saw 2 vehicles. One was a ranger truck, same model as mine, parked neat at the edge of the lot. The other was a beat-up sedan sitting crooked near the trailhead, driver's door hanging open, dome light glowing a weak yellow inside. The abandoned vehicle, presumably. The one Marcus had called about. But I didn't see Marcus. I parked, left my engine running and my headlights on, and I got out. It was cold up there, that thin, high mountain cold that gets into your lungs, and it was silent in the way only high places are silent, where even the wind seems to be holding still. I called out for Marcus. My voice went out into the dark and came back with nothing. I keyed my radio and asked where he was, and his voice came right back, calm, close. He said he was just up the trail a little ways, that he'd started up to look for the hiker, and I should come meet him, follow the trail. He wasn't far. I looked at the ranger truck parked in the lot. Marcus's truck. The engine was off, the hood cold when I touched it, like it had been sitting there for hours. And I thought if he only just started up the trail, why is his truck stone cold? I want to be honest about my mindset here, because I think it matters. At this point, I was scared. But I was also a professional with years on the job, and professionals talk themselves out of fear constantly. It's practically the job description. So I told myself the truck was cold because it was a cold night, and cold nights cool an engine fast. I told myself Marcus's slightly off answers were just radio confusion, the kind that happens all the time on those mountain frequencies. I told myself the open door on the sedan and the possible injured hiker were the real emergency, and my job was to focus on that and stop spooking myself. But I did one thing that probably saved my life. Before I started up that trail, I walked over to the sedan and looked inside. It was empty. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Nothing dramatic. Just an ordinary car. But there was a purse on the passenger seat, and next to it, a park map, and a paper coffee cup in the holder, and the little details of a normal person's normal day. I looked at the registration in the door pocket. The car belonged to a woman, and the coffee cup, when I touched it, was still faintly warm. Warm coffee. Up here in the cold at 4 a.m. That meant whoever owned this car had been here recently. Very recently. Not hours ago. Minutes, maybe. And here's the thing that made me step back from that car with my heart starting to pound. Marcus's first radio call, the one that woke me at 4:17, said he'd found an abandoned vehicle and signs of a hiker in trouble. But if the coffee was still warm, the vehicle hadn't been abandoned when he called. The owner had still been here, or close, when Marcus first radioed me. So either Marcus had lied about it being abandoned, or the call I got at 4:17 came from someone who was watching this woman arrive, watching her get out of her car, and describing the scene to me while it happened, calling it abandoned, because he already knew it was about to be. I backed away from the sedan toward my truck, and I keyed my radio, and I asked Marcus a question. I asked him what color shirt he was wearing. A dumb question on its face. But Marcus and I had a thing we did, a habit from years of working together, where we'd describe what we were wearing over the radio when we couldn't see each other in the dark, so we wouldn't mistake each other for a stranger and startle. It was our little routine. If this was really Marcus, he'd know exactly why I was asking. And he'd answer without missing a beat, and probably rib me for it. There was a pause on the radio. Longer this time. Then the voice said, warm and easy, "Same shirt I always wear, buddy. Come on up, you're burning moonlight." And that was wrong. That was so wrong that I felt it in my teeth, because Marcus would have said the color. That was the whole point of the routine. He'd have said green or gray, and then made fun of me for asking. He wouldn't have dodged it with a friendly non-answer. The thing on the other end of that radio knew Marcus's voice, knew his laugh, knew his easy manner, but it didn't know our routine. It didn't know the answer, so it talked around it, smooth and confident, hoping I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I got back in my truck, quietly. I didn't slam the door. I pulled it shut soft. And I sat there with the engine running and the heater going, staring up at the black trail where the voice wanted me to go, and I made myself think. The radio came alive again. Marcus's voice, still friendly, but with something new underneath it now. A thread of impatience. He asked where I was. Said he could see my headlights down in the lot, so he knew I'd arrived, and asked why I wasn't coming up. He could see my headlights, which meant he could see me, which meant he was up there somewhere on that dark slope, looking down at my truck, watching me sit in it and not come. I turned my headlights off, and in the sudden dark, before I could second guess it, I put the truck in reverse and started backing out of that lot, slow and careful on the gravel, no lights, just the faint gray of the sky to steer by. The radio said my name, not backup, not ranger, my name, Kevin. And then it said, in Marcus's voice, but flat now, all the warmth gone out of it, "Where are you going? You just got here." I backed down that mountain road in the dark, for as long as I dared, which wasn't long, because those switchbacks would kill you in daylight, never mind blind. After maybe a quarter mile, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I turned my headlights back on, swung the truck around in a spot barely wide enough to do it, and drove down the normal way, facing forward, going as fast as the road would let me. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the mirror. Nothing behind me. Just the dark and the dust my tires kicked up. The radio stayed quiet for a while. Then, when I was maybe 2 miles down from the trailhead, it started again. And this is the part that I've never been able to fully explain to anyone. The part that makes people look at me sideways when I tell it. The voice on the radio changed. It was still Marcus at first, calling my name, asking me to come back, telling me the hiker needed help, that I was abandoning a woman in trouble, that this wasn't like me, that he was disappointed in me, playing every card it could to turn me around. And when that didn't work, when I didn't answer and didn't turn around, the voice shifted, mid-sentence. Marcus's voice sort of slid sideways into a different voice, a woman's voice, frightened and crying, saying she was hurt. She was up by the north face. She needed a ranger. Please, please come back. She could see my lights leaving, and she was begging me not to go. The woman from the sedan, or something using her voice the way it had used Marcus's. And then that voice slid again into a child's voice, a little kid crying for help, lost and cold and calling for anyone to come find them. And then another voice, and another. It cycled through them, one after another, all of them scared, all of them pleading, all of them coming out of my radio in the pitch dark on a mountain road at 4:30 in the morning. It was running through everyone it had, is what it felt like. Everyone it had ever taken. Trying each voice like a key in a lock, looking for the one that would make me turn the truck around. I turned the radio off. Not down. Off. All the way. And I want you to understand how hard that was, because turning off your radio in the backcountry is a thing rangers just do not do. That radio's your lifeline. It's the difference between living and dying out there. Turning it off felt like cutting my own rope. But I could not listen to those voices anymore, and some instinct told me that as long as I kept answering, kept listening, kept engaging with it at all, I was giving it a way to reach me. So I killed the radio, and I drove the rest of the way down in total silence, just the engine and my own breathing and the gravel under the tires. I got back to the main ranger station right around 5. The sky was just starting to go gray at the edges. I went inside, locked the door behind me, which I had never once done in all my years of night shifts, and I sat down at the desk, and I tried to think about what to do. The reasonable move was to call this in. Get the sheriff, get the daytime rangers, get a real search team up to that trailhead at first light. There was a woman's car up there with warm coffee in it. That was real. Whatever was happening with the voices, there was a genuine missing person, and she needed help that I was equipped to organize. So I picked up the station's landline, the actual phone, not the radio, and I called our dispatch, the county line that connected us to the sheriff and to the other rangers. And a woman answered, our regular overnight dispatcher, a person I'd talked to 1,000 times, and I started explaining, fast, about the trailhead and the abandoned car and Marcus, and she stopped me. She said, Kevin, Marcus is right here. I didn't understand. I asked what she meant. She said Marcus had come into the county dispatch office about 20 minutes earlier, that he'd driven back from the coast early, decided to check in before heading home, and he was standing right there in the office getting a cup of coffee. She said, hang on, and I heard her call his name, heard footsteps, and then Marcus's voice came on the line, the real one. I knew it was real because the first thing he said was, Kevin, why do you sound like that? What's wrong? And then before I could answer, he said, and why is it green, in case you're about to ask? It's always green. The shirt. The routine. He gave me the answer without even being asked, ribbing me for a question I hadn't gotten to ask yet, because that's what the real Marcus would do. That's how I knew beyond any doubt that the man on the phone was actually him, and that the thing on the radio up at the North Face had never been Marcus at all. I told him everything. as fast as I could. The 417 call, the trailhead, the coal truck that looked exactly like his, the voices. And Marcus went quiet. And then he said something that made the hair stand up all over my body. He said, "Kevin, I never called you. My radio's been off since I left town 4 days ago. And that truck you saw up there? All our trucks are accounted for at the station. I'm looking at the lot right now. Every single one is here. There's no Ranger truck up at that trailhead. There can't be. But I'd seen it. I'd touched the hood. Cold metal. Real as anything. A Ranger truck. Our model. Parked neat in that lot next to the woman's sedan. And that's when I finally understood what I'd almost walked into. It hadn't just been imitating Marcus's voice. It had built a whole scene to pull me in. A truck that looked like ours, parked to make me think a Ranger was already there. A real abandoned car. A real missing woman. To make the emergency feel true. And a voice that knew my friend well enough to fool me. All of it arranged like a stage set on the side of that mountain, waiting for me to park my truck and walk up that dark trail toward the one thing in the whole scene that was actually real and actually waiting. Marcus said he was getting the sheriff and a team together right now, that they'd meet me and go up to that trailhead together at first light, in force, in daylight. He told me to sit tight at the station and not go anywhere. I agreed. I hung up the phone. And in the quiet after, I heard something that told me sitting tight at the station was not going to be enough. The radio I'd turned off, all the way off, the one with no power running to it at all, made a small sound of static. And then Marcus's voice, soft and patient, said, "You told them, and that's all right. I know where you are now." I stared at that radio for a long time. It was off. I'd turned it off with my own hand in the truck, and it had stayed off the whole drive down. And it was off now, sitting there on the desk with its little power light dark. Radios don't talk when they have no power. That's not a scary story thing. That's just electricity. A dead radio is a dead radio. And yet I'd heard it, clear as day, in Marcus's voice, telling me it knew where I was. I unplugged it from the wall just to be sure, pulled the power cord clean out, and I picked up the handheld radio I carried on my belt, the battery-powered one, and I turned that off too, and I took the battery out of it, and I set both of them on the far side of the room, as far from me as the station would allow. Then I sat back down at the desk, and I waited for daylight and for Marcus and the sheriff, and I tried to keep myself together. Here's the thing about waiting alone in a ranger station in the dark when you know something's out there, and it knows where you are. Your mind turns on you. Every ordinary sound in that little building became a threat. The building settling, the refrigerator in the break room, the wind against the windows. I knew rationally that these were just the sounds an empty building makes at some night, the same sounds I'd ignored for years. But now every one of them made me flinch, because I couldn't stop imagining that thing coming down off the mountain, wearing whatever face it needed to wear, walking down the service road toward the little lit window where I sat. And that's when I noticed the window. The ranger station had big windows across the front, looking out at the parking lot and the road beyond. During the day, you could see the whole valley. At night, with the interior lights on, all you could see was your own reflection and the black glass. I'd been sitting with my back to those windows the whole time, facing the door, because the door felt like the threat. But some prickle on the back of my neck made me turn around and look at the glass. And in the reflection, in the lit-up interior of the station, reflected back at me in the dark window, I could see the room behind me. The desk, the chairs, the far wall where I'd set the radios. And standing near the door to the back hallway, in the reflection, was a park ranger. I spun around in my chair. The room was empty. Nobody by the hallway door. Nobody anywhere. Just me. I turned back to the window, slow, and the ranger was still there in the reflection, standing by the hallway door, in uniform, same as mine. But where the face should have been, in the reflection, there was just a kind of smeared blankness, like a photograph of a person with the face rubbed out. It didn't move. It just stood there in the reflected room, in a spot where the real room was empty. I understood then that it hadn't needed to come down the mountain at all. It didn't travel the way people travel. It had been reaching me through the radio, through Marcus's voice, through every voice it tried, and now it had found a new surface to stand in. The dark glass, the reflection. It was in the window, in the mirror version of my station, standing in a room that looked exactly like mine, except it had a visitor. I did the only thing I could think of. I got up and I turned off the interior lights. With the lights off, the reflection vanished. You can't have a reflection in a window without light behind it. The room went dark. The window went from a black mirror to just plain darkness, with the faint gray dawn beyond it. And the ranger with no face was gone, because there was no longer a reflected room for it to stand in. I stood in the dark, breathing hard, and I thought maybe I'd figured out a rule. It needed a way in, a radio, a reflection, some surface or channel it could use. Take those away, and it couldn't reach you. I held on to that idea like a life raft, and I sat in the dark and I waited. And slowly, the sky outside got lighter, gray, then pale, then touched with the first real color of morning. And with the daylight came the sound I'd been praying for. The sound of engines on the service road, several of them, headlights swinging into the lot. Marcus and the sheriff and a whole team, right on time, at first light, exactly like they'd promised. I have never in my life been so relieved to see other human beings. I went to the door and unlocked it, and stepped out into the cold morning air. And there was Marcus climbing out of the lead truck, and 2 sheriff's deputies, and a couple of the day shift rangers, all of them geared up and serious, ready to head to the North Face and search for the missing woman. Marcus came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I told him no, not really, but that I would be. He said they'd take it from here, that I'd been up all night and been through something nobody would believe, and that I should go home and sleep. He said they'd handle the search. And I almost did. I almost got in my truck and drove home, and let them go up that mountain without me. But I looked at the group of them, all standing there in the gray morning light, and I did a head count, the way you do, the way it's drilled into you. Marcus, 2 deputies, 2 day rangers, 5 people who'd driven up in 3 vehicles. I counted the shadows on the ground, stretched long by the low morning sun. There were 6. I stood there in the parking lot counting shadows and coming up with one more. Then there were people, and I want to describe exactly what that was like, because it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quietest kind of terror there is. 5 men standing in the morning light, and 6 long shadows stretched across the gravel. And one of those shadows didn't have a person standing at the top of it. It just lay there on the ground, the shape of a person, attached to nothing. I didn't say anything at first. I just counted again, slower, making sure. Marcus, 2 deputies, 2 day rangers, 5, 6 shadows. And the extra one, I noticed, was pointing the wrong way. All the real shadows fell to the west, away from the rising sun, the way shadows are supposed to. The extra one fell to the east, toward the sun, like it belonged to a light source that wasn't there, or to a person standing where no person stood. Marcus was talking, telling me again to go home and get some rest. And I looked up from the shadows, and I looked at the faces of the men in front of me, and every one of them was a face I knew. Marcus and the 2 deputies I'd met before, and the 2-day rangers I worked with every week. All real, all familiars, all accounted for. So I asked the question that had been building in me since 4:17 that morning. I asked out loud to the whole group, "Who's standing behind me?" Because that extra shadow, the one pointing east, was stretched out from a spot right behind where I stood. And every one of the 5 men looked at me and then looked past me at the empty gravel behind my shoulder, and I watched their faces change. I watched Marcus's easy expression fall away. I watched one of the deputies take a step back and put his hand on his belt. They were looking at something behind me, something I couldn't see because it was behind me and it cast no reflection and it made no sound, but they could see it. 5 men in broad daylight, all staring at the same empty patch of air right behind my shoulder, and all of them going pale at once. I didn't turn around. I want to be clear about that. Everything I'd learned that night told me not to turn around, not to look at it, not to give it my attention or my acknowledgement, because looking was how it got in. Through the radio when I listened. Through the window when I looked. It needed you to turn toward it. So I didn't. I stood dead still, facing my friends, and I said, very calmly, "Don't any of you look at it directly. Get in the trucks. We're leaving, right now." And to their enormous credit, they did. Nobody argued. Marcus grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the lead truck, keeping his eyes down. And the deputies and the day rangers scrambled into their vehicles. And we all got in and shut the doors, and Marcus threw the truck in reverse and got us out of that lot fast, gravel spraying, and not one of us looked back at whatever had been standing behind me in the morning sun. We never went up to the north face that day. We called in the state police and a full search and rescue team, and they went up in a big group in the middle of the day, and they found the woman's sedan exactly where I'd said it would be. Empty. Warm coffee, long gone cold. They searched that whole mountain for a week and never found her. She was never found. Her family got the same nothing that every family gets in these stories, and I have carried the fact that I drove away from that trailhead, that I turned my truck around instead of going up to look for her, every single day since. But here's the twist, the part that took me years to understand, the part that I've only recently made my peace with. I went back through the records after all of it settled down, the old logs, the incident reports, the histories of that trailhead near the North Face, and I found something. That trailhead had a pattern. Every few years, going back decades, a hiker would go missing there, and every single time, without exception, a second person would go missing too. A searcher, a ranger, or a volunteer, a family member, who went up looking for the first one. The trap always took 2. The lost hiker was the bait. The searcher was the meal. It didn't want the woman in the sedan, not really. She was just the warm coffee, the lure, the thing that would make a good ranger drive up a mountain at 4 in the morning to help. The one it actually wanted was the one who came to help. The one it wanted was me, and I realized that the 417 call, the voice wearing Marcus, the whole stage scene with the fake truck, it wasn't trying to hurt the woman. She was already taken. It was trying to get me to complete the pair. That's why it worked so hard. That's why it cycled through all those voices, why it followed me down the mountain, why it reached through a dead radio and stood in my window and finally came all the way to my station and stood behind me in the light, it had its first. It just needed its second. It needed me to turn around one time and look at it and acknowledge it and become the searcher who never comes back. I never turned around. That's the whole reason I'm still here. Not because I was brave, because I was too scared to look. And being too scared to look turned out to be the only thing that saved me. I left that job about a year later. I couldn't work nights anymore. I couldn't stand the radio, couldn't stand dark windows, couldn't stand the sound of a friend's voice coming out of a speaker when I couldn't see their face. I moved on. I do something else now. Something indoors, something with no mountains and no trailheads and no service roads that climb up into the dark. But I still count shadows. It's a habit now, one I can't break. Every time I'm in a group, out in the sun, I count the people, and I count the shadows, and I make sure the numbers match. Most of the time they do, almost all of the time. There have been 3 occasions in all the years since where they didn't. 3 times, in a crowd, in the daylight, I've counted one more shadow than there were people. And all 3 times, I felt that same old prickle on the back of my neck. That sense of something standing just behind my shoulder, patient, waiting for me to do the one thing I've promised myself I will never do again. So if you're ever out somewhere bright and open, and you get a cold feeling on the back of your neck, and some quiet part of you is sure that someone is standing right behind you, do yourself a favor. Count the shadows first, and whatever the number tells you, do not turn around. Let me start with a fact that took me a long time to accept. Some places don't want to be mapped. I know how that sounds. I work with maps for a living, or I used to. 6 years as a backcountry ranger at a wilderness area up in the northern part of the state, and if you'd told me back then that a stretch of forest could have opinions about being measured, I'd have laughed and offered you coffee. My whole job was measurement, trail distances, elevation changes, water levels, campsite counts. I trusted numbers the way some people trust religion. Numbers don't lie to you. Numbers don't get scared. That's what I thought. My name is Dale, and I'm 41 now, which means the thing I'm about to tell you happened almost 15 years ago, back when I was still young enough to think I understood the world. The wilderness area I patrolled was huge, something like 90,000 acres, and only 4 of us to cover the whole thing. We each took a section, and mine was the western quarter, which was the most remote and the least visited. Weeks would go by without me seeing another human being who wasn't a co-worker on the radio. I liked it that way. I'm not a people person. That's part of why the job suited me. Just me, the trees, my gear, and a whole lot of quiet. Now, every section had its quirks. The eastern quarter had a river that flooded every spring and washed out the same bridge no matter how many times we rebuilt it. The southern quarter had a cave system that hikers were always getting lost in. My western quarter had something the old rangers called the blank. The blank was a valley, not a big one, maybe a mile across, tucked between 2 ridges in the deepest part of my section. And the reason they called it the blank was simple. It wouldn't hold data. Compasses spun in there. GPS units lost their signal and never got it back until you climbed out. Every attempt anyone had ever made to survey it properly had failed because the measurements never matched. You'd walk the same route twice and get 2 different distances. You'd photograph the same rock formation from the same spot on 2 different days, and the photos wouldn't line up. The official explanation was mineral deposits, some kind of iron-rich rock underground that messed with instruments. That's what the paperwork said, and I believed the paperwork because believing the paperwork was easier than the alternative. The blank had one rule, passed down from ranger to ranger for as long as anyone could remember. You could hike through it. You could even camp on its edges if you had to. But you never, ever spent the night at its center. Not because anything bad had ever officially happened there. Just because. It was tradition. The kind of rule nobody questions, because questioning it feels like bad luck. I kept that rule for 4 years without ever thinking about it. And then, in my 5th year, a research team showed up with permits from the regional office, and everything I thought I knew about my own section of forest started to come apart. There were 3 of them: a geologist named Karen, a grad student named Tyler, and their equipment guy, a quiet, older man named Gary, who I never heard say more than 10 words at a stretch. They'd come to study the magnetic anomaly in the blank. Real scientists, real funding, real permits I couldn't argue with. My job was to escort them in, keep them safe, and get them out again. Simple. Karen was sharp and friendly, and clearly the leader. On our first night at the trailhead, over the camp stove, she asked me what I knew about the valley. I gave her the mineral deposit explanation, the same one I'd always believed. She nodded along, but there was something in the way she looked at me, a kind of careful patience, that made me feel like she knew something I didn't. Then she said, "Iron deposits don't do what this place does. We've looked at the readings from the last survey attempt. Whatever's down there, it isn't in the rock." I asked her what she meant. She just smiled, poked at the fire, and said, "That's what we're here to find out. That's the whole reason they sent us instead of a normal survey crew." I didn't think much of it at the time. Scientists like to sound mysterious. But I remember that Gary, the quiet one, looked up from his gear when she said it, and he looked at me across the fire with an expression I couldn't read. Not fear, exactly. More like sympathy. Like he felt sorry for me and didn't want to say why. We hiked in the next morning, and the moment we descended into the blank, my compass started to spin, slow and lazy, like it was looking for something it couldn't find. I'd seen it do that 100 times. But this time, for reasons I still can't explain, watching that little needle turn made the back of my neck go cold, and some quiet voice in the back of my head that I'd never listened to before said, very clearly, "Turn these people around and go home." I didn't listen. I wish I had. Valley floor was strange in a way that took me a while to put into words. It was too even, and that's the best I can describe it. In a normal forest, the ground rolls and dips. Roots break the surface. Rocks jut up where they please. But the floor of the blank was smooth and flat, like something had come through a long time ago and pressed it down. The trees grew straight and evenly spaced, almost like an orchard, except no one had ever planted them, and it was silent. Not the good kind of forest silence where you can still hear the small stuff, birds and wind and bugs. This was a total silence, the kind that makes your own heartbeat sound loud. Karen noticed it too. She stopped about 20 minutes in, held up her hand, and asked the group to just listen for a second. We all stood there. Nothing. No bird song, no insects. Tyler, the grad student, said something like, "That's not normal, right? Even the anomaly shouldn't scare off the wildlife," and Karen just wrote something in her notebook without answering. Gary set up the first round of equipment near the center of the valley. Magnetometers, seismic sensors, a couple of things I didn't recognize. And this is where it got interesting in the way that a slow leak in a boat is interesting. The instruments couldn't agree with each other. 2 magnetometers sitting 3 feet apart gave readings that were wildly different. Gary moved them, recalibrated them, swapped them, and it didn't matter. The numbers refused to settle. Karen loved it. To her, this was a puzzle, and she was thrilled to be inside it. She kept saying things like, "There's a structure to this, we just have to find it." And she had the team lay out a grid across the valley floor with little flags so they could take readings at fixed points. I helped them plant the flags. Boring work, but it kept my hands busy, and honestly, I was glad for the distraction, because that voice in the back of my head hadn't gone quiet. It had gotten worse. By late afternoon, they had their grid finished. 100 little orange flags in a perfect 10 by 10 square across the middle of the blank. Karen sent Tyler to walk the grid and take a reading at every flag, one by one, calling out numbers while Gary logged them. And that's when the first genuinely wrong thing happened. Tyler counted 103 flags. We'd planted 100, 10 by 10. I'd counted them myself as I placed them, because that's the kind of person I am. 100 exactly. But when Tyler walked the grid, he came back and said there were 103. Karen laughed and told him to recount, figured he'd double back on a row. He walked it again. This time he counted 98. Karen stopped laughing. She walked the grid herself, slow and careful, touching each flag as she passed it. She came back pale. She'd counted 101. Then she asked me to do it, since I was the one who planted them, and I'd know if any were mine and any weren't. I walked that grid 3 times. I got 100, then 104, then 99. Same flags, same square, same me. Different numbers every time. Now, I want to be fair here. There are boring explanations for a lot of this. It's easy to lose count. Flags can lean and hide behind each other. Your eyes play tricks in flat, repetitive terrain. I told myself all of that out loud to the group in my most reassuring ranger voice, and they wanted to believe me, I could tell. But there was one detail that none of us could explain away, and it's the detail that started to change the mood from scientific curiosity to something quieter and colder. Some of the flags were the wrong color. We'd brought orange flags. Only orange. I unpacked them myself. But scattered through the grid now, maybe 6 or 7 of them, were flags of a faded, dirty white. Old ones. Weathered like they'd been out in the sun and rain for years. Karen picked one up and turned it over in her hands, and on the little white flag in handwriting none of us recognized was a number. Just a number, written in old faded ink. It said 14. She checked another white flag. That one said 9. Another said 22. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Tyler asked the question we were all thinking, which was, 14 what? 9 what? And Gary, the quiet one, who had barely spoken the entire trip, said in a flat voice without looking up from his equipment, people. It's counting people. Karen asked him what he meant by that. How he could possibly know that. Gary finally looked up, and he looked older than he had that morning somehow, like the valley had added 10 years to his face. He said, because I've been here before. 20 years ago. Different job, different crew. We planted flags too. And by the end, the flags were counting us. And there were more numbers than there were people, because it had already started keeping the ones who didn't make it out. He paused, and then he said the thing that made my stomach drop. I'm the only one who came back. And I swore I never would. But when the regional office offered me this contract, they didn't tell me where it was until we were already on the trail. By then, it was too late to say no. I asked him why he hadn't warned us, why he'd let us walk in. And Gary said very quietly, because it doesn't let you warn people. Watch. Try to tell them right now, plainly, that we all need to leave. Try to say the words. I opened my mouth to do exactly that. To turn to Karen and Tyler and say we're leaving. Right now, pack up, we're going. And I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. My throat closed up like I'd forgotten how to speak. I could talk about anything else. I could describe the weather, the trail, my own name. But the moment I tried to form the specific idea of leaving, of escape, of getting these people out, my voice simply stopped working, and a pressure built behind my eyes like the beginning of the worst headache of my life. I looked at Gary. He nodded slowly like he'd known exactly what would happen. "It doesn't want us to go," he said. "Not yet. It's still counting." The sun started going down, and that changed everything, because now we had a decision to make that none of us wanted to make. The rule I'd lived by for 4 years, the one every ranger before me had passed down, was simple. You don't spend the night at the center of the blank. And here we were, 4 people standing in the exact center. As the light drained out of the sky, unable to say the words that would get us moving. I tried a different approach. If I couldn't say we should leave, maybe I could just do it. Actions instead of words. I started packing up my own gear, slow and casual, figuring I'd get the others to follow by example. And that worked for about a minute. Tyler saw me and started rolling up his sleeping pad. Karen began collecting her notebooks. For a moment, I thought we'd found the loophole. Then Tyler stopped, holding his half-rolled pad, and got a confused look on his face. He said, "Wait, why am I packing? We're not done with the readings." And he unrolled it again and sat back down. I watched it happen in real time. The intention just leaked out of him, like water through a cracked cup. Karen did the same thing 30 seconds later. She looked down at the notebooks in her hands, frowned, and set them back out as if she'd never meant to move them at all. It was working on me, too. I'd get my pack halfway loaded, and then find myself standing there wondering what I'd been doing, and I'd set the gear back down and feel strangely calm about it. Like everything was fine, like there was no reason to hurry. The valley was making us forget. Not all at once. Just enough. Just the one specific thought that would save us, plucked out of our heads over and over the second it formed. Gary was the only one it didn't seem to affect the same way, and I asked him why. He said it was because he'd been here before, that once you've survived it, some part of you stays awake to it forever, and it can't put you back to sleep as easily. But he also said that didn't help him much, because being awake to it just meant he got to watch it happen with his eyes open. We ended up building a fire as it got dark, because there was nothing else to do when the cold was coming on fast. And around that fire, Gary finally told us the whole story of what had happened 20 years before. I'm going to give it to you the way he gave it to us, because it matters for what came after. His old crew had been 5 people. They came to survey the valley, same as us, and they ran into the same problems. Instruments that wouldn't agree. Counts that wouldn't hold. And on their second night, against the rule, they'd camped in the center because a storm rolled in and it was the only sheltered spot. That night, one of them walked off into the dark and didn't come back. They searched the next day and found nothing. No body, no tracks, nothing. But that evening, when they counted their remaining gear, there were still 5 sleeping bags laid out. 5, even though there were only 4 of them left. The next night, another one walked off. Same thing, gone without a trace, and still 5 sleeping bags. Then 4 people became 3, and there were still 5 sleeping bags. And by then, the survivors understood that the valley wasn't losing count of them. It was keeping the full number. It refused to let the total go down. Every person it took, it replaced with the memory of a person, held in place by an empty sleeping bag that no one would admit to noticing. Gary was the last one standing. He said he only made it out because on the final night, he stopped trying to leave. He stopped fighting it. He sat by the fire and did nothing at all, made no plans, formed no intentions, just emptied his head and waited. And somehow, at dawn, he found his feet carrying him up out of the valley on their own, like the thing had lost interest in a man who'd stopped struggling against the hook. "That's the trick," he told us, staring into the fire. "It feeds on the trying. Every time you plan to escape and it stops you, it takes a little piece. The counting isn't really about numbers. The numbers are just how it shows you the score. What it's actually counting is how many times each of us has tried to run and failed. And when your number gets high enough, when you've been worn down enough times, that's when you get up in the night and walk off into the dark and become one more empty sleeping bag." Tyler asked the obvious question. He asked how high the number could go before it took you. And Gary looked across the fire at the little white weathered flags still stuck in the grid behind us, the ones with the old faded numbers on them, and he said, "The highest one out there right now says 22. That was the last member of my old crew, the one who lasted the longest before I made it out. He tried to leave 22 times." He was quiet for a moment. "I found a new white flag while you were building the fire. It's stuck at the edge of the grid. It wasn't there this afternoon." Karen asked what number was on it. Gary didn't answer right away. Then he said, 3. And every one of us understood, without him having to explain, that the valley had started a new count. That the flag with the 3 on it wasn't from 20 years ago. It was from today. It was one of us. We just didn't know which. I did the math in my own head, quietly, counting the times I'd tried to pack my bag and been made to forget. I'd tried 3 times. Exactly 3. I didn't tell the others. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to, because the second I tried to form the words, my throat closed up all over again. Nobody slept that first night, which was fine because sleeping was the last thing any of us wanted to do. Gary had made that much clear. The valley took people when they drifted off or when they got up in the dark, half awake, and wandered. So we kept the fire high, and we kept our eyes open, and we talked. About anything, about nothing, just to keep each other anchored to the waking world. Karen told us about her kids. Tyler talked about a road trip he'd taken across the country the summer before. I told them about the time I'd rescued a hiker who'd gotten himself stuck on a ledge and cussed me out the whole way down. Small human things. It helped. For a while. But somewhere in the deepest part of the night, I noticed something that I kept to myself, because I didn't want to be the one to say it. There were 4 of us around the fire. Me, Karen, Tyler, Gary. But every so often, out of the corner of my eye, in the flickering edge of the firelight, it looked like there were 5. A 5th shape, sitting just past Gary, in the dark space between the light and the trees. When I turned to look straight at it, there was nothing there. Just an empty patch of ground, and the black wall of the forest beyond. But when I looked back at the fire and let my eyes relax, the 5th shape came back, sitting quietly with the rest of us, listening to our stories. I told myself it was exhaustion. Your eyes do things at night when you're tired and scared. But then I caught Tyler looking at the same spot, and then quickly looking away, and I knew he was seeing it too. And neither of us said a word about it because saying it out loud felt like an invitation. Dawn came finally, gray and slow, and with the light, the 5th shape was simply gone, and the pressure in the valley eased just enough that we could breathe. Gary said the daytime was safer. Not safe, but safer. The counting slowed down when the sun was up. That gave us a window, and Karen, to her enormous credit, used it. She was a scientist to the bone, and even terrified, even exhausted, she was still trying to understand the thing that had us. She spent the whole morning studying the grid, the flags, the readings, and around midday she called us over because she thought she'd found something. She'd been comparing the numbers on the old white flags with their positions in the grid, and she'd noticed a pattern. The flags with the highest numbers, the 22s and the 19s, were all clustered near the exact center of the valley. The lower numbers, the ones just starting their count, were out toward the edges. It was like a spiral. The longer the valley worked on you, the closer to the center it drew you, until finally you reached the middle, and you were gone. "It's not random," she said, and there was a spark of hope in her voice that I hadn't heard since we'd walked in. "It has a shape, and anything with a shape has a way out. We just have to move against the spiral, outward, away from the center, not trying to leave, not planning to escape, just physically moving in the one direction it doesn't want us to go, a little at a time, so it doesn't notice the intention behind it." And it was the first real plan any of us had come up with, and it made a strange kind of sense. If we couldn't hold the thought of escape in our heads, then we wouldn't try to. We'd just walk outward. No plan, no destination in our minds, just one foot placed a little further from the center than the last. We wouldn't let ourselves think about the trailhead or home or freedom. We'd only think about the next step and the next, drifting outward as casually as we could manage, hoping the thing that fed on our trying wouldn't recognize a plan that never let itself become one. So that afternoon, we started to drift. We'd move our little camp 50 feet toward the western ridge, then sit and rest and talk about nothing, then move it another 50 feet, always outward, always casual. And it worked. That was the terrifying, exhilarating part. It actually seemed to work. By evening, we'd moved almost a quarter mile from the center, and the pressure behind my eyes had lifted. And the silence didn't feel quite so total anymore. Once, I even heard a bird. A single bird, somewhere up on the ridge. I nearly cried at the sound of it. We made camp that second night much closer to the western edge, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I let myself believe we might actually get out. Gary allowed himself a small smile. Karen was practically glowing with the satisfaction of having cracked the puzzle. Tyler fell asleep finally, and we let him, because we were close enough to the edge now that Gary thought the risk was lower. And that's when I found the flag. I got up to gather more wood, and at the base of a tree just past our new camp, stuck in the dirt where it had no business being, was a fresh white flag. Not weathered, not old, bright white, brand new, planted that very day. And on it, in that same faded old handwriting that shouldn't have been possible on a brand new flag, was a number. It said 4. I stared at it for a long time, because I understood something then that undid the entire plan, that undid the little bird and Karen's spiral and the hope I'd let myself feel. We hadn't been moving toward the edge. We'd been moving exactly where it wanted us to go the whole time. The spiral Karen found was real, but she'd read it backward. The center wasn't where it took you. The center was where it kept the ones it had already finished with, the high numbers, the trophies. The edge, the western ridge, the way out, that was where it did its actual work. That was the mouth of the thing, and we'd spent all day walking cheerfully into it, congratulating ourselves the entire way. And the number on the flag was 4, my number, because I'd tried to leave 3 times that first day, and gathering this firewood, drifting toward this edge, believing I was escaping, was the 4th try. It had counted my hope as one more attempt. Karen's whole clever plan had just been the valley's smartest way yet of getting us to keep trying. I turned to run back to the fire, to wake the others, to tell them we'd gotten it exactly wrong. And behind me, from the direction of our camp, I heard Gary's voice call out, calm and quiet in the dark. "Dale, don't come back. Whatever you see, keep walking away." I didn't keep walking. I couldn't. Everything in me pulled back toward that fire, toward the 3 people I was supposed to protect, and I ran back to camp as fast as the dark would let me. Gary had told me not to. I want that on the record. He warned me, and I ignored him, and the same way I'd ignored that quiet voice on the first day. I've had 15 years to think about whether that made me brave or just stupid, and I still don't have an answer. When I got back to the fire, Tyler was standing up. He'd been dead asleep 2 minutes before, and now he was on his feet, facing the western ridge, the direction we'd been drifting all day. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything. He had that slack, peaceful look on his face, the one Gary had described, the one people get right before they walk off into the dark and don't come back. And Karen was reaching for his arm, saying his name, trying to pull him back, and Gary was shouting at her to let go, to not touch him. Because touching someone the valley had called was how it got 2 for the price of 1. Karen didn't let go. Of course she didn't. She had kids at home and a good heart, and she wasn't the kind of person who could watch a 24-year-old grad student walk into the dark and just let it happen. She grabbed his arm with both hands and dug her heels in. And I finally understood what the numbers really counted. Not how many times you tried to leave. That was close, but it wasn't the whole truth. What the valley counted was how much you had left to lose. Every time you tried to run, you weren't just failing. You were showing it how badly you wanted to live, how much you cared, and that wanting was the thing it fed on. That was why Gary, who'd given up hope 20 years ago and stopped trying, who kept his head empty and his heart flat, was the one it left alone. It had already drained him dry the first time. There was nothing left in him to take. And it was why Karen, full of love and hope and a plan she believed in, had the highest hunger on her the entire trip. She just never saw her own flag. Gary told me later he'd hidden it. Hers said 9. She pulled Tyler back from the edge. She actually did it. For one shining second, she yanked him off his feet and away from the ridge, and I thought, we made it. She saved him. We're going to be okay. Then she went still. Her hands were still gripping Tyler's arm, but her own face had gone slack now, peaceful, empty. Tyler blinked, suddenly awake, confused, alive, and Karen turned toward the western ridge with that same faraway look, and she let go of him, and she started walking into the dark. We went after her, Gary and Tyler and me. We got maybe 30 feet before the trees seemed to fold around her, the way a crowd closes up after someone passes through, and she was just gone. No sound, no scream. 1 second, she was ahead of us in the dark, and the next, the space where she'd been was empty forest, and no matter which direction we ran, we couldn't find a single trace of her. Not a footprint, not a dropped notebook, nothing. Gary grabbed both of us and said the only thing that saved our lives. He said, "Stop looking for her. Stop wanting her back. If you keep wanting, it'll take you too. You have to let her go. Completely, right now, in your heart." And I want you to understand how monstrous that was, what he was asking. To stand in the dark and force yourself to stop caring about a woman who'd just been dragged off. To hollow out your own heart on purpose so the thing wouldn't smell your grief. But we did it. God help me, we did it. Tyler and I sat down in the dirt, and we made ourselves go blank. Made ourselves feel nothing, thought about nothing, wanted nothing, while Gary talked us through it in a low, steady voice like a man landing a plane. And at dawn, empty and numb and hating ourselves, the 3 of us walked up out of the western ridge and out of the blank, our feet carrying us the way Gary's had carried him 20 years before, because we'd finally stopped giving it anything to hold on to. We reported Karen as lost in a fall. It was the only story that made sense on paper, the only thing the words would let me write. The official search found nothing, which surprised no one, given the terrain. Her family got a memorial and no answers. I've carried that lie for 15 years, and it's the heaviest thing I own. Here's the plot twist, though, and it's the reason I finally decided to tell this story out loud instead of taking it to my grave. About a month ago, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old survey photo of the blank from decades back, a wide shot of the whole valley floor. And in the margin, in faded old handwriting I recognized instantly, was a note. It said, "You never really left. You just stopped counting. Come finish the survey. We saved you a flag." I called Gary the day I got it. His number was disconnected. I drove out to the address I had for him, and a young family answered the door and told me the old man who'd lived there had walked off into the woods behind the house 8 months ago and never come back. They'd never found him. So I don't know what to tell you. I got out of that valley, or I thought I did. I emptied my heart and I let Karen go, and I walked out into the sunlight. And I've spent 15 years believing the flat, numb thing I did to survive was temporary. But you don't get to feel nothing on purpose and then just switch caring back on when it's convenient. I've been half empty ever since. Ask my ex-wife. Ask the friends I stopped calling. Maybe that's the real count. Maybe the valley never had to take the rest of me all at once. Maybe it's been drawing me back to the center, slow, one hollow year at a time, and the flag with my number on it has just been sitting out there in the grass this whole time, patiently going up. If you ever take a job in the backcountry, and the old rangers tell you there's one valley you don't camp in, don't ask them why. Don't get curious. Curiosity is just wanting wearing a nicer coat. And out there, wanting is the only thing that can kill you. I'm not going back to finish the survey. I want to be clear about that in case this is the last thing anyone ever hears from me. Whatever walks off into the woods behind my house one of these nights, whatever they don't find when they search, it won't be me choosing to go. It'll just be the count finally reaching the number it started writing on a little white flag 15 years ago while I stood there in the dark and told myself I was getting away.
Thank you for watching, and what do you think about that stories? I hope you enjoy and see you on the next video. Bye.